Dear colleagues, shall we start? Are you ready? Once again, dear colleagues, I'm really impressed by the turnout, and I appreciate you all coming to our meeting, which I promise will be an interesting one. Many of you have heard that Russia complains about the rules-based order and says it contradicts the international law. Have some patience today, and you will have an exciting journey into the world of the rules-based order. I promise that it will not be dull and you will not be yawning during our meeting, as our presentations will offer you some clues into this wonderful new world. Since not so long time ago, some of our colleagues invented a new paradigm, the world of highly likely, the world behind the looking glass. It's very simple, but I have to admit it is very effective. One has just to name the guilty, even without presenting any evidence, and enjoy the support of its numerous allies who eagerly cry wolf in unison. And who is the wolf? Most often today it's Russia, despite that Russia is not a wolf but traditionally a bear. Besides Russia, there are a few more wolves. Syria, for example, which is accused of using chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, the use of which is inadmissible and unjustifiable under any circumstances. Syria has surrendered its chemical arsenal in 2013-2014 and has become a member of the OPCW. Nevertheless, it continues to be accused of using chemical weapons against its own population. Our repeated questions, what dividends it gives the Syrian government on the battlefield, especially in a situation when it already was winning the war against terrorism and was the least interested to call for fire against itself, are left unanswered. But these accusations led to missile attacks by the US in 2017 and later by US, France, and UK in 2018. The so-called Zarin chemical episode in Khan Shaykhun was the reason for a US missile attack in April 2017. Despite inconclusive and fake evidence where people ran around Zarin bomb crater unprotected and no remains of the aerial bomb were found, and many other inconsistencies, the Syrian government was named guilty by the Joint Investigation Mechanism, which led to the demise of JIM because it compromised itself with flawed and biased conclusions in the style of highly likely. And the highly likely was present in the report, by the way. If I invoke the style of highly likely, I can't but refer to another episode of this foul game, the Skripal case. I will not go into it in detail, but simply remind you one instance. With Skripals going around Salisbury already contaminated with a deadly chemical agent early morning, and suddenly, after hours of walking around, collapsing on a bench in a park, only to immediately be rescued by the chief chemical nurse of the British Army, who coincidentally happened to be nearby. And this was without being contaminated herself. But now we come to the center of our today's discussion, the chemical incident in Syrian Duma. Why is it so important? Because it was a justification of missile strikes by US, France, and UK in April 2018, who immediately named the Syrian government guilty. The inspectors of the OPCW fact-finding mission were dispatched to the mission in Duma, and were able to conduct their investigation soon after the strikes were over. They did conduct investigations, took the samples, and left for The Hague to write a report. And then started the mystery. And I ask you to listen to it, and I promise you will enjoy the exciting journey. Some of our colleagues don't like it. They call it a Russian disinformation campaign. Even today, we received a press release of the UK mission to the United Nations where it claims that, quote, Russia has chosen to use its privileged platform to try and discredit the well-respected OPCW and its staff, unquote. Listen to the presentations and decide for yourselves what we are trying to do, to discredit the OPCW or to find truth and to restore trust in the organization. trust seriously undermined in recent years. And now I would like to give the floor to Alexander Shulgin, our ambassador, the Russian ambassador in the Netherlands and the permanent representative of Russia to the OPCW.
Thank you, Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Our meeting today is devoted to the report of the fact-finding mission into the use of chemical weapons in Syria, the FFM, concerning the incident in Duma in Syria on the 7th of April 2018. In raising this matter for discussions before members of the UN Security Council, we're doing this because what happened there directly affects the questions of international peace and security and, consequently, falls under the competencies of the Security Council. Many of those in this room probably recall the worrying circumstances at the beginning of April 2018. The US was preparing to launch, as they said, their own smart, in inverted commas, missiles against the Syrian Arab Republic. And Russian service personnel were warning that they were ready to destroy not only those missiles, but also their delivery systems if Russian service personnel were placed in jeopardy, those service personnel who were located in the Syrian Arab Republic on the invitation of the legitimate Syrian authorities. People of the older generation would inevitably have been reminded of the terrible atmosphere, the atmosphere of jeopardy surrounding the Caribbean, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and getting to the bottom of what took place in Duma allows us to conclude that in the future such situations of this sort should not be allowed to take place again, situations fraught with uncontrollable consequences. This is the role of responsible states and first and foremost the Security Council. Unfortunately, we have weighty grounds to believe that the investigation into the incident conducted by the Specialized International Organization for the Prevention of the Use of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, in the form of its fact-finding mission that was specially created, at the very least, leaves a great deal to be desired. To get a better understanding of the situation, I will briefly remind you of the course of events that took place after the initial reports in Western media of the so-called chemical attack in Duma. You will, of course, remember that the starting point for all of this was the video clip, the latest video clip filmed by the White Helmets providing medical attention and first aid to the victims of a chemical attack in Duma. This clip was circulated and played endlessly on all of the Western media outlets, whipping up the public to fear a new crime having been committed by the Syrian regime, as the Western terminology would have it. In the grip of this just rage, the United States and also the United Kingdom and France, without waiting for the investigation through the OPCW, which should take place in such circumstances, on the night of the 13th to the 14th of April 2018, launched missile strikes on the Syrian Arab Republic, as it were by way of retaliation. However, following the events in Khan Sheikhoun in April 2017 and what followed that, the scenario of automatically placing blame on Damascus suddenly flew into action. The Syrian government forces and Russian service personnel and the Russian military police were in Duma merely days after the so-called chemical attack took place. Hot on the trails of this, they were able to find Syrians who were surprised by this white helmet's clip. They were surprised to be presented as people who were allegedly suffering from the effects of a toxic chemical substance. And it turned out that nobody had been poisoned by anything. Rather, they had become unwitting extras in the latest false flag operation and provocative staging conducted by the White Helmets. And those 13 people, merely 13 people, including a young boy, Hassan Diaba, reported this at a special briefing in OPCW headquarters on the 26th of April 2018. After that, this unfortunate clip made by the White Helmets suddenly disappeared from the Western countries' media, and it was no longer mentioned in the Western media. It's noteworthy that previously the same fate had awaited the well-known photograph of the children poisoned in Khan Sheikhoun. Those photographs existed, and then suddenly they disappeared and nobody mentioned them anymore. It's very similar to this case. It's the same algorithm that is being applied in both cases. At the same time, the OPCW mission that had at last reached the Syrian Arab Republic began its investigation. With the full support of the Syrian authorities to provide the necessary conditions for their work, access to all of the sites, and also under the protection of the Russian military police, ensuring the physical security of the OPCW experts. The investigation dragged on for a long time. There were a great many strange things that emerged in it. For example, the head of the FFM in Duma, he actually didn't go to Duma at all. Moreover, only a few hours after arriving in Damascus, he immediately went to, as the OPCW put it, a neighboring country, where he remained for the remaining time of the work of working, as we understand it, for the Syrian armed opposition. The samples that were processed from Duma laid untreated in the central laboratory of the OPCW in Rijswijk, as though nobody had anything to do with them and nobody needed them for any reason. In contravention of the established rules, Syrian government representatives, these materials were not shared with the Syrian government representatives, referring to the heavy burden of work on the laboratory staff and some other organizational difficulties. For better or worse, one way or another, the report was eventually published, the report of the FFM, on the 1st of March 2019, nearly a year after the events. Presenting it at a briefing at the OPCW headquarters. I mentioned this briefing with Hassan and the other witnesses. Their testimonies were almost entirely, or were entirely, ignored. However, on the basis of 3 allegedly independent expert analyses, they discovered traces of the use of a chlorine chemical substance, and people were led to the idea that these cylinders containing chlorine were allegedly dropped from the air. Now, it's very clear that that conclusion immediately placed the blame on the Syrian government forces, because on the 7th of April in Duma on the 7th of April was under the control of the armed opposition. That conclusion differed from the conclusions of Russian military observers, who were confident that the cylinders containing chlorine were taken to the sites by fighters by hand for provocative purposes. And after my briefing, with the President's permission, I can show you some slides that illustrate this state of affairs. In the run-up to the March 2019 session of the OPCW Executive Council, it became evident that the conclusion from this FFM report contradicted the conclusions of members of the team, the FFM team, who were responsible for the engineering part of the investigation. And so our proposal to have a briefing involving all of the specialists that took part, all of the experts that participated in the investigation seemed logical, but it was refused. Initially, it was refused for formal and procedural reasons, and then as a result of a vote that was brought about by the American colleagues. The US and its allies, as the American representative explained, did not want to, and I quote, this is what the American representative said at the Executive Council meeting, the emergence of a Stalinist process in The Hague of intimidation and cross-examination. Now, looking into the future, jumping ahead, I'll say that this is the only argument that our opponents use when they argue against an investigation to get to the bottom of this. That's the argument that they use. They've not provided or aren't providing any other arguments. They refer to plots and disinformation, but in addition to that, they don't really have anything to say. As for the Russian side, we continue to try to get the OPCW Technical Secretariat to conduct a professional investigation into the assessments of what took place in Duma. At the beginning of April 2019, during the visit of the Director General, Fernando Arias, to Moscow, the Russian Ministry of Defense provided him with a dossier that had been collected containing the conclusions of the Russian military experts, which at the very least differed from the conclusions in the March FFM report, and it was requested that he take that into account in detail. And then the Russian Federation circulated its comments on the content of the 1st of March FFM report. A similar analysis was conducted and submitted to the Technical Secretariat by the Syrian Arab Republic. In response, we and the Syrians received purely a formal pro forma answer. There was no response in substance. The FFM's work on this high-profile case in Duma did not take into account the work of relevant and knowledgeable experts from a number of countries. Some of them are known as the Robinson Group, and they sent several questions and requests to the Technical Secretariat immediately. And in response, they were high-handedly suggested to read the 1st of March FFM report again. But on the substance of the questions that they asked, they did not receive any answers. Russia, for its part, proposed that the Technical Secretariat publish the results of the ballistic and other expert analyses, forensic analyses conducted by the 3 independent experts that that led to the conclusion of chlorine cylinders being dropped from the air. That was refused, this time under the pretext of ensuring the personal physical security of those 3 specialists. Even when we explained in a further request that we had no interest in the personal information of those people and that we only wanted to understand their thinking and their logic and their reason, we were not immediately, but a long time later, sent another refusal containing the same standard wording about the preservation of confidentiality. Given that position from the Technical Secretariat, we and a whole host of other delegations developed legitimate concerns and suspicions as to whether those expert analyses existed at all and whether they were conducted at all and whether the reference to them had only been made in order to present a de facto conclusion that an air bombardment had taken place. Against that backdrop, The publication of this was the result of an investigation conducted by the director of the Foundation for the Study of Democracy, Maxim Grigoriev, but he is going to tell us about that himself in detail because he's here with us in the room. In the face of this ratcheted up situation, the Technical Secretariat at last, after a long time, admitted that when preparing the FFM report on Duma, individual dissenting opinions had been expressed, one or two. But ultimately, we were assured that collective reason had won the day. And allegedly, the decision was taken by an overwhelming majority of members of the mission on the basis of all of the information that had been gathered. Not information that was gathered from the site of the events themselves, as is required under the CWC, but rather taken in other provinces and other places controlled by the opposition. The media then, in particular the British Daily Mail on the 24th of November 2019, on Fox News as well on the 25th of November 2019, circulated materials from the Courage Foundation with information from new whistleblowers of the fact that the 1st of March report had been tailored to fit the conclusions. Based on the public information and correspondences from within the OPCW that were leaked, it turned out that in the initial report of the FFM, that report was radically different, and it's not clear who changed it, and the conclusions were moved from certainty to the opposite of certainty. In other words, the poor people putting together the report did not know what it was that they were giving life to. Moreover, between the writing of the initial report, the interim report, since that time, almost all of the members of the FFM that worked in Duma were removed. So essentially a forgery took place. In these conditions, a group of prominent scientists, public figures, experts, including the first Director General of the OPCW, the Brazilian Bustani, came together in the form of the Courage Foundation and sent to all states parties to the CWC a letter with a proposal to get to the bottom of the situation, which was casting a shadow over the authority of the OPCW. At the session of the Conference of States Parties, the highest body in the OPCW in November last year, Russia and also other countries called on the Technical Secretariat to listen to the voice of the international public and civil society, organizing a briefing with the involvement of the experts involved in preparing the investigation in Duma. The Technical Secretariat once again sent a group of Western countries to help, led by the US. They said that they had the highest confidence in the self-sacrificing, devoted experts that did the work. But new questions continue to arise. From the latest material published at the end of 2019 on WikiLeaks, we can see that it wasn't just one or two people who didn't agree with the FFM official conclusions, but several. We were constantly told that there were only one or two dissenting opinions, but everyone else almost in unison supported the mission's conclusions. But it turns out that wasn't the case at all. For a long time now, it has become clear to many people that the methods of work of this mission need to be brought into account with the requirements of the Convention. The absolute need to go to the place where the alleged chemical weapons use took place, and themselves to gather samples and other substances, to strictly adhere to the basic rules of ensuring the chain of custody of physical evidence, guaranteeing the geographically balanced nature and makeup of the mission, ruling out a predominant weight of experts exclusively from countries that are allied to Washington. But the real problem is that these common sense and logical concerns come up against categorical rejection from a number of Western countries led by the USA. It's becoming absurd now. Any comments on the work of the mission are immediately presented by our American and British colleagues as a slap in the face, slander of devoted, self-sacrificing OPCW experts and the Director General Fernando Arias himself. The statements made by a number of countries and proposals made by a number of countries to improve the working methods of the FFM are also rejected in the same way. The US-led Western group in 2019 obstructed the Russian and Iranian initiative, leading to the adoption of that resolution from the Executive Council. In other words, from what I'm telling you, it is evident that the organization is now seeing a deadlock emerge within it. The Technical Secretariat is backed up by the unquestioned support of the US, the United Kingdom, and their other followers, and is not planning to do anything, wailing over the fact that everything will come out in the wash, as it were. But it will not. It will not be resolved of its own accord. Very soon, reports from the so-called Investigation and Identification Team will begin to emerge, a team that was created by an illegitimate decision of the Conference of the State Parties in June 2018, granting the Technical Secretariat so-called attributive functions in gross violation of the CWC and to the detriment of the exclusive prerogatives of the UN Security Council. Whatever the Technical Secretariat may say to us about taking into account dissenting opinions from one or two FFM staff members, the official conclusion on Duma, enshrined in the March report, has a nuance of accusation against Damascus and is predominant, and will give rise to other dubious FFM reports. So what would be the value of other FFM reports giving these glaring violations of the chain of custody in the case of the 24th and 25th of March 2017 in Sarakib, on the 4th of February 2018, and so on? All of these investigative activities were conducted remotely. Just think about that. Instead of actually going to the site where the event took place, they were done remotely and, above all, relying on the opinions of the opposition that are hostile towards the government and NGOs that are sponsored by Western countries. Meanwhile, the categorical judgments of the FFM members condemning Damascus suddenly amorphously become vague when it comes to the actions of fighters on the basis of material provided by the Syrian legitimate authorities. A clear example of the 1070 district in Aleppo this is a clear example of that. The current history, with a very vague OPCW official report, looks like a rotten sore, and if we cannot get rid of that sore, we will not be able to move forward. In which case, how can we have any confidence in the Technical Secretariat, and how can there be any confidence between the states parties? Therefore, we once again propose that we aim to achieve the conflict situation that has arisen by, under the OPCW, and possibly with the support of all states that are not indifferent to this state of affairs, holding a briefing with the involvement of all of the FFM experts that worked on the incident in Duma in order to at last find a consensus conclusion of what happened in this high-profile case in this city in Syria. That needs to be done at any cost, imperatively. The price of failure or error, as in the case in Duma and many other stories, could have extremely serious consequences for the stability and security of the entire world. Where, if not in the walls of the UN, a central element of the system of international relations, are we to agree on potential joint actions under the central documents of the UN and also the Chemical Weapons Convention? Some may think that Russia and other countries are focusing on the strange elements in the work of the FFM, or to put it bluntly, the falsification of this for the benefit of just a few states, and saying that Russia is provoking an already raging confrontation within the OPCW. But in fact, the confrontation is being driven by the US and its standard group of supporters. I didn't see anything surprising or new in the press release from the UK mission to the UN, once again accusing us of a campaign of disinformation, of spreading lies, conspiracy theories, attacks on the OPCW. But unlike our American colleagues, the British colleagues, who, if I may say so, use these confrontational terms, and I would also like to recall that the American representative at the Conference of States Parties compared the Technical Secretariat to a granite monster that is quaking in the wake of these Russian-provoked attacks. This confrontational element, in that we actually see the Technical Secretariat as our common home, where the Director General, Arias, as he constantly says, member states need to feel comfortable and freely able to look at the problems that arise with a view to achieving a consensus. I would like to express the hope that today's informal meeting of the Security Council will help those responsible states to realize the need to overcome the difficulties that exist, to do away with the ratcheting up politicization in this, and to get down to resolving the tasks in the convention, linked first and foremost with the destruction of existing arsenals of chemical weapons and also the fight against chemical terrorism. Russia, for its part, will do everything that depends on it to achieve those goals, to restore a united organization that truly deserves its status as Nobel Prize winner. This is also in the interest of us, handing to the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, a further message from academics from the Courage Foundation with a call for helping to restore confidence and a normalization of the situation in the OPCW. Thank you.
I thank you, and I would like to request you to continue. Introduced three, I think, right? 3 technical files on the incident.
В продолжение моего рассказа.
To continue the story about the situation in the OPCW and about why we're raising this legitimate question or legitimate questions over the quality of the work that's been done by OPCW experts. I'd like to show you the results of the work and observations done by Russian military experts who visited the site of the events in Duma just a few days afterwards. The following evidence and facts recorded by Russian military observers is useful, and to make it clear, I'm going to show you 2, 3, or maybe 4 slides. So slide number 1.
Первый и немаловажный.
The first and certainly very important element is the computer model of the descent of the chlorine cylinder. As we can see from the FFM report, it shows that all of the calculations conducted for the impact of the chlorine gas cylinder with the physical object reached 30 to 60 meters a second, which corresponds to a drop height of 45 to 180 meters. And on this image, you can see the result of the cylinder falling from 150 meters. However, we can say with confidence that the Syrian Air Force, for safety concerns, does not fly over inhabited areas at heights of less than 2 kilometers, because when flying at only 200 meters in areas of hostilities, there is an evident threat of being fired at and shot down. In the case of the cylinder being dropped from the height used by the Syrian Air Force, it would have developed a vertical velocity of around 200 meters per second and would certainly have smashed through a roof not only of a thickness of 20 centimeters, but would have done much more damage. And so there would have been substantial damage. Slide number 2. The site of cylinder falling at location 2. In location 2, the form and shape of the hole that was formed is more similar to a body falling through the reinforced concrete at 80 degrees from the surface. And that would be in line with the deformation of the rebars. The drop of the cylinder does not correspond to the deformation that could have been caused by a cylinder full of liquid chlorine in the aforementioned conditions. Therefore, the main part of the cylinder would have been deformed in a much more substantial way. It would have been damaged much more. Now, look. This cylinder is falling allegedly at great speed. Now, where exactly do you see the damage to the main part of the body of the cylinder that would have been caused by that? You can't. That damage isn't there. The same goes for the fact that the cylinder falling through the cylinder should have changed its angle and trajectory, which is not in line with the hole in the roof that was formed. Slide 3. Now, falling through the reinforced concrete slab in this building and also the craters and depressions, these correspond more to the explosion of a mine or an artillery shell approaching on a landward trajectory. And this is demonstrated by the traces of rubble and shrapnel on the walls. The crater, it seems, was formed by artillery shells or by a similar munition, and that is confirmed also by the presence of more than one piercing place that is very similar in external form to what we can see lower down the building. And there you can see a similar, on the right-hand side, you can see a similar puncture damage. Slide number 4. The location 4, where the cylinder fell. At location 4, the relative dimensions of the hole do not correspond to the dimensions of the cylinder that was on the bed in the room. The hole, when looking at the diameter, is much more than twice the diameter of the cylinder, which does not correspond to the puncture action of a firm body through a reinforced concrete slab. The damage to the rebars probably more likely illustrates a puncture wound rather than a physical hard entity falling through the roof. This does not correspond to the deformation that would have been caused if there had been a plastic puncture wound. As a result, the body of the cylinder would have been needed to be flatter, and the fins at the head of the cylinder would have had much more damage, deformation, or they would have been missing altogether. Here we can see that they were not damaged. Now, how is that possible if the cylinder allegedly smashed through a massive reinforced concrete barrier, obstacle. And then lastly, slide number 5. If the cylinder had smashed into the roof over a room, it would not have been able to move sideways without causing damage and harm to the floor, the walls, the glass and the furniture in that room, and there's no indications or traces of that. Samples taken from the place of the incident, as reported in the FFM report, say that there's trinitrol, which is a trace of an explosive, which shows that there was an explosive deformation rather than the result of a cylinder falling through it. So this is just to say in a few words, I'd like to say a few more words about this picture. If you look, this is the room where this cylinder fell through. The cylinder is lying on the bed. Now, I weigh about 90 kilograms. If I uncautiously throw myself down on a bed, I always break something. The strut falls out, the slats falls out, or something else. But here, just imagine the vast weight and the impact of a large cylinder filled with liquid chlorine descending with great velocity, smashing through a reinforced concrete roof of 30 centimeters, falls through that roof, ricochets off the walls wildly, then flies to one side at an angle, contrary to all the laws of physics, and then hits the bed. And here, as though in a film, it sort of lays down lightly on the bed, engages a brake, as it were, and then the cylinder, like a white swan, descends onto the bed without causing any damage or disruption at all. Now, just think about what would happen if that cylinder flew into a flat, making all that noise and causing all that damage, and then compare that with what you can see in the pictures there. That is the situation in which that cylinder was found. So it raises massive questions, and questions to which, unfortunately, we've not received any answers. And that's just part of the questions that our experts have. Our experts also have questions over the chemistry, the toxicology, the questioning of the witnesses. And these legitimate questions that we are trying to get to the bottom of, this is perfectly natural. Can this really be called disinformation? Who can distort language so much and talk about disinformation in the context of the questions we have over these slides? So it's not disinformation at all. It's an invitation to have a serious expert-level conversation. Thank you.
I thank Ambassador Shulgin, and now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Maxim Grigoriev, Director of the Foundation for the Study of Democracy.
Members of Security Council, dear guests, let me introduce myself. I'm director of NGO, the Foundation for the Study of Democracy, that holds consultative status in the United Nations Economic and Social Council. Our volunteers have been to Syria more than 10 times and interviewed several hundreds witnesses of different events. NGO, the Foundation for the Study of Democracy, conducted an independent evaluation of the Duma incident on 7th of April 2018. We have interviewed 15 witnesses in the Duma hospital, 10 residents of a house in Duma where human bodies were found, 300 residents of houses situated within 1 kilometer from the building where the bodies were found. The testimony of witnesses is an undisputable proof that the chemical attack in Duma was falsified. We went to the hospital that was filmed by the White Helmets. The hospital personnel and Syrian civilians completely refuted those staged rescues. An example of testimonies of a doctor who witnessed those events is on the screen. Our findings prove that no people suffered from chemical attacks in Duma hospital and that the White Helmet statements were all fabricated. We interviewed 10 residents of the house where human bodies were found in Duma. By all means, this is the first thing to be done to investigate the accident. The fact that OPCW mission did not do this proves their low level of competence or lack of willingness to reveal the truth. Volunteers assisted us in conducting poll among 300 residents of the buildings which are situated within 1 kilometer from the building where the bodies were found. On the screen. Task: to identify the dead bodies on the video footage. The results of the poll: no one of 300 interviewed residents of the area recognized any of the bodies in the video footage mentioned in the OPCW report. Conclusions based on the interviews where the permanent residents of the building where the bodies were found are: witnesses who stayed there all day on the 7th of April 2018 were not affected. According to the evidence given by the witnesses, their children and elderly parents who stayed in the building on the 7th of April 2018 were not affected either. Among the bodies shown on video footage, there are no residents of the building or of its nearby buildings. Those data unequivocally prove that the incident on the 7th of April 2018 was fake, as well as the dead bodies belonged neither to the residents of the building nor even to people from the neighborhood, but were brought from elsewhere for staging. It can be inferred therefrom that those people had been killed especially to organize this falsification. Now I will cite exact words of some of the witnesses who were permanent residents of the section of the house where the bodies were discovered. Siham Haiti, 42 years old. Question: how long have you been living in this building? Answer: 5 years. Question: with whom do you live? Answer: 5 children, 19, 18, 12, 21, and 7 years old. Question: were you at home on the 7th of April last year as well? Answer: yes, we were here. Question: some videos have appeared on the internet featuring dead bodies in this building. Had this been the case, would it have killed all your family as well? Answer: yes. Question: and what happened to you? Answer: well, nothing. Question: I will show you another video. Watch it carefully. Is this your staircase? Answer: yes. Question: do you recognize any of those people? Have they ever lived here? Answer: I don't know any of them. They brought the bodies here and staged the whole thing. Next witness is Imam Kraim, 20 years old, permanent resident of the house. Question: last year on the 7th of April, were you here with your family? Answer: yes. Question: on the internet, it was stated that people who stayed in this building died of chlorine. It means your parents should have died as well if chlorine had actually been there. Answer: we stayed here every day, my father and mother. We did not feel anything. Had there been anything, they would have fallen sick. Next witness, Mahmoud Miqbal, 57 years old, permanent resident of the house too. His exact words are on the screen. Question: have you been here on the 7th of April last year? Answer: I have. Question: last year, a video footage showing the bodies of dead people appeared on the internet. It stated that this building had faced a chemical attack. How can you explain that people's bodies were in the building and you did not experience any damage to your health? Answer: it never happened at all. Next witness is Nadia Jar, 23 years old, permanent resident of the house too. Her exact words are on the screen too. Question. This video footage has appeared on the internet. It was filmed in this building, in particular in this apartment. The video footage states those people died here of chemical attack. Do you recognize any of those people? Answer, no, I don't recognize anyone. Next witness, Kamal Ali Fustuki, 24 years old, baker. His exact words are on the screen too. Question, what happened to your brother? Answer, my brother was killed in an artillery shelling. They brought his body here, took a picture, and told he had died in a chemical attack, just over there. Next witness is Muhammad Kader Abdul Kader, 40 years old, driver, permanent resident of the house. He eyewitnessed how the falsification was organized. I quote his exact words. You can see them on the screen. The fighters were shooting at the windows, not allowing us to watch. The militants brought dead bodies by cars. I saw 10 to 15 dead bodies of people unfamiliar to me. End of quote. Next witness, Fayez Amar Fatoum, 45 years old, butcher, permanent resident of the house. He also eyewitnessed how the falsification was organized. I quote his exact words. You can see them on the screen. We live on the first floor. We were attacked by fighters. With their faces covered, they were shooting in the air. We were forced to go outside. The white helmets were there too. The fighters brought the dead bodies from prison Al-Toba. End of quote. Those witnesses of falsification, tell how exactly it all happened. The fighters who came with the white helmets brought dead bodies, intimidated locals, shot at windows, forcing some people to leave their homes and isolating the rest in their apartments. Then they brought the bodies outside and filmed the footage. One body the fighters left outside was identified by a witness. It was his brother, who had earlier been killed in an artillery shelling and taken by fighters from hospital. The remaining bodies, as the witnesses supposed, were brought from the Al-Toba prison, where fighters kept the people they captured, including women and children. Taking into account that other bodies had no injuries, the witnesses are confident that the people featured in the video recording were killed just to organize the falsification. The testimony presented above unequivocally proves that the chemical attack on the 7th of April 2018 was falsified. When preparing the report, OPCW abstained from inquiring the above-mentioned witnesses who were permanently residing at the place of incident and were ready to testify. By all means, this is the first thing to be done to investigate the accident. The fact that OPCW mission did not do this proves their low level of competence or lack of willingness to reveal the truth. OPCW used data provided by people who may not have been present at the scene of incident and who were inquired in Idlib governorate and in other countries. OPCW deliberately used falsified materials provided by the white helmets as the main basis for their conclusions. On 11th of March 2019, a briefing was held at OPCW. I presented our report, White Helmets, fact-checking by eyewitnesses and former volunteers. It contains numerous proofs that falsification of chemical attacks was an essential part of the work of White Helmets, and they cannot be considered as a credible source of information. Officials of OPCW concealed conclusions made by its experts, deleted a number of vital facts from the report, and falsified the report itself. For the first time, over 23 years of its existence, officials of the OPCW take part in falsification of a report. This is an unprecedented blow to the reputation of the OPCW. Secretary General of the United Nations is depository of the Chemical Weapons Convention. OPCW works based on this convention. NGO, the Foundation for the Study of Democracy, prepared a letter addressed to the Secretary General that contains testimonies of above-mentioned witnesses. I kindly request to circulate it among Security Council members in order to reveal the truth about the falsification of chemical attack in Duma on 7th of April 2018. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grigoriev. And now I would like to give the opportunity to speak to another participant of our event whose video address and printed statement that will be distributed shortly we received through a member state. Ian Henderson, the former inspector of the OPCW, who participated in the Duma FFM mission. Please look at the screen.
Good afternoon, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Henderson. I'm a former OPCW inspection team leader, having served for about 12 years. I heard about this meeting. I was invited by the Minister Counselor of the Chinese mission to the UN. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances around my ESTA visa waiver status, I was not able to travel. I thus submitted a written statement to which I will now add a short introduction. I need to point out at the outset that I'm not a whistleblower. I don't like that term. I'm a former OPCW specialist who has concerns in an area, and I consider this a legitimate and appropriate forum to explain again these concerns. Secondly, I must point out that I hold the OPCW in the highest regard, as well as the professionalism of the staff members who work there. The organization is not broken, I must stress that. However, the concern I have does relate to some specific management practices in certain sensitive missions. The concern, of course, relates to the FFM investigation into the alleged chemical attack on the 7th of April in Duma in Syria. My concern, which is shared by a number of other inspectors, relates to the subsequent management lockdown and the practices in the later analysis and compilation of a final report. There were 2 teams deployed. One team, which I joined shortly after the start of field deployments, was to Douma in Syria. The other team deployed to country X. The main concern relates to the announcement in July 2018 of a new concept, the so-called FFM core team, which essentially resulted in the dismissal of all of the inspectors who'd been on the team deployed to locations in Douma and had been following up with their findings and analysis. The findings in the final FFM report were contradictory, were a complete turnaround with what the team had understood collectively during and after the Douma deployments, and by the time of release of the interim report in July 2018, our understanding was that we had serious misgivings that a chemical attack had occurred. What the final FFM report does not make clear, and thus does not reflect the views of the team members who deployed to Douma, in which case I really can only speak for myself at this stage. The report did not make clear what new findings, facts, information, data, or analysis in the fields of witness testimony, toxicology studies, chemical analysis, and engineering and/or ballistic studies had resulted in a complete turnaround in the situation from what was understood by the majority of the team and the entire Douma team in July 2018. In my case, I had followed up with a further 6 months of engineering and ballistic studies into the cylinders, the result of which had provided further support for the view that there had not been a chemical attack. This needs to be properly resolved, we believe, through the rigors of science and engineering. In my situation, it's not a political debate. I'm very aware that there is a political debate surrounding this. Perhaps a closing comment from my side is that I was also the inspection team leader who developed and launched the inspections, the highly intrusive inspections of the Barza SSRC facility just outside Damascus. And I did the inspections and wrote the reports for the 2 inspections prior to and the inspection after the chemical facility or the laboratory complex at Barza SSRC had been destroyed by the missile strike. That, however, is another story altogether, and I shall now close. Thank you.
Just for the record of the participants, I would like to mention that we invited both the Director General of the OPCW and the representatives of the Technical Secretariat of the OPCW to this meeting, but they didn't choose to participate in it. And now I would like to give the floor to the permanent representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to the United Nations, Mr. Bashar Jafari.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nebenidzia. I'm gratefully thankful to you for organizing this meaningful, informative, and indicative meeting. I'm also thankful to Ambassador Shulgin and to Gaspadin Grigori as well as to the Inspector, Mr. Henderson, for their meaningful contribution today. After what was said, I'm afraid that I don't have much to add, except some details that might be of interest for the distinguished audience. Actually, the story did not start at Duma. The story of the so-called use of chemicals did not start at this small town located in the suburbs of Damascus, Duma. The story started long time before, and to be precise, on December the 8th, 2012. On December the 8th, 2012, the Turkish newspaper, Yurt, reported that Al-Qaeda members are producing chemical weapons in a laboratory near the Turkish city of Gaziantep, that they are threatening to use against Syrian civilians, and the Turkish newspaper Yurt drawn the attention to videos posted on the internet of Al-Qaeda demonstrating how to make poison gas from such chemicals as Al-Qaeda has obtained from Turkish companies and tested on living creatures. Actually, they tested these toxic materials on rabbits. And the video footage is there for those who would like to see further details about this ugly experience. Then, on March the 19th, 2013, another incident took place at Khan al-Asal, another small town located in the suburbs of Aleppo, this time in the north. Khan al-Asal is a peaceful, small town located in the suburbs of Aleppo. And on March the 19th, 2013, a missile fell in this area, killing 25 civilians as well as military Syrians from the Syrian army, and wounding 110 civilians and soldiers. All of them were taken to governmental hospitals in the area. When this incident happened, I got instructions from my government to go immediately to the Secretary General, at that time Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and ask him for assistance. I went to his office and I asked him for assistance to achieve two goals. A, to determine whether chemicals were used or not in this attack. B, to determine the identity of the perpetrators of this attack. The Secretary General asked me to give him some time to consult with some members of the Security Council. Then around 11 o'clock, an hour before midnight, he called me back and said, Mr. Ambassador, please inform your government that after consulting with the big guys in the council, I'm ready to assist your government in achieving only A, meaning whether chemicals were used or not. I asked him, what about B, determining the identity of the perpetrators? He said, I'm sorry, I couldn't convince the council to help you out with this. Those who refused to assist us with B were hoping that with such negative answer, the Syrian government would change its opinion. We did not. We went the whole way. In the morning, I called him back. I said, my government agrees. Let us start work. Let us start working and identify whether the chemicals were used or not in this attack at Khan al-Asal. We all know that such materials, the chemicals, wouldn't stay too long in nature. They might evaporate, they might disappear, the place, the location of the attack might be manipulated, etc., etc. Only scientific experts could explain this to you in details. We said yes, thinking that the Secretary General would send the experts to Syria in a couple of days, as soon as possible, as he promised me. To be honest with you, it took the Secretary General 4 months and 11 days to be able to form a team held by Dr. Sellström from Sweden to go to investigate what happened in Khan al-Asad. 4 months and 11 days. The scientific experts would tell you that any investigation after such a long period of time wouldn't respect what they call the chain of custody. We said, okay, send Dr. Sellström, please. We are waiting for him. Dr. Sellström arrived in Damascus, and he was about leaving the hotel, going to Khan al-Asal, when another chemical attack took place, incidentally speaking, incredibly speaking, amazingly speaking, in the Ghouta, which is the suburbs of Damascus. Dr. Sellström received a phone call from Mr. Ban Ki-moon asking him not to go to Khan al-Asal, but to go to the Ghouta. And till now, the incident of Khan al-Asal has not been investigated. Since that date, certain countries have started the manipulation and politicization of the OPCW work, including its reports. As it was clear to everyone, the reports of the Joint Investigation Mechanisms, JIM, were tampered with by some members of the Security Council, namely the United States, Britain, and France. The JIM so-called reports were only intended to make false conclusions that only suits the interests of those 3 countries. Actually, here we are not reinventing the wheel. The wheel was invented by the Sumerians 5,000 years ago. But here we are talking about the chemical wheel. Syria also asked the OPCW to investigate other incidents, including those in Yarmouk, October 22nd, 2017, the incidents in Khirbet al-Masasni, July 7th, 2017, the incidents in Qleb Thor, in Salamiyeh, August 9th, 2017, and the incident of Al-Balil in Suran, November 8, 2017, but unfortunately the OPCW did not respond to our requests in a positive and a timely manner. The same thing happened with these incidents, the same thing that happened with Khan al-Asal incident. Unfortunately, some countries led by the United States of America continue to exceed the provisions of the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons by politicizing the work of the OPCW and trying to derail from the track it was created for. In this regard, it is crucial to draw attention to the attempts of those governments to exercise kind of propaganda in the interest of the so-called IIT and to support it by all means. I reaffirm that the Syrian Arab Republic, along with a considered number of states keen to implement the provisions and purposes of that convention, continues to consider that the decision to establish the so-called Investigation and Identification Team, IIT, which was adopted by vote at the 4th special session of the Conference of the States Parties to the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in 2018, is illegitimate. And it is important to remember that this decision was not consensual and was only supported by less than half of states parties. Meanwhile, the majority of member states considered this decision contrary to the provisions of the Convention and viewed it as a dangerous precedent by granting a technical organization some mandates that fall within the scope of the Security Council exclusively. Accordingly, the Syrian Arab Republic does not recognize this team and refuses to grant it any access to confidential information provided by Syria to the organization and to the Security Council, and refuses any future conclusions from this team as well. We all remember what happened in the case of Iraq, when the influential powers at that time, those who invaded Iraq, manipulated the records of UNSCOM and UNMOVIC to justify an aggression against Iraq, militarily speaking. We all remember what later on the head of these two commissions revealed, saying that the two committees, the two commissions, did not find any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So they are repeating the same rhetorics, the same redundancy, thinking that this time they might succeed again with Syria the way they did it with Iraq. The difference between the two cases is that in the case of Iraq, 2 mechanisms were enough to destroy Iraq. In the case of Syria, they have established so far 6 mechanisms. 6 mechanisms still looking for the 6 of the angels in Syria. It was striking the rejection of the request made by Syria and the Russian Federation to hold a closed hearing for the fact-finding mission team to answer all questions raised about the Duma report. Needless to say that the countries that committed a brutal military aggression on the Syrian territory on April 14th, 2017, using the alleged incident in Duma as a pretext, were the same countries that defended this report even before the OPCW investigated the alleged incident. The Syrian government is deeply astonished and concerned of the irresponsibility demonstrated by the High Representative, Mrs. Nakamitsu, who should have demanded the OPCW to take into consideration the leaked information in order to restore confidence of the organization and its teams. We believe in Syria that the time has come for a leadership of the organization to take concrete and immediate action to preserve the independence, prestige, and credibility of the OPCW. Don't let these countries destroy the OPCW the way they destroyed the League of Nations and the way they are going to destroy the United Nations. The OPCW need to set the record right and to show the world that there was manipulation on all its reports against Syria, the way Mr. Henderson explained it to you a few minutes ago. Since the creation of the FFM, it has not been fulfilling its mandate in accordance with the provisions of the OPCW, of the CWC. For example, the FFM conducts its investigation from a long distance, depending fully on so-called open sources. They are dealing with serious political matters the way kids play with the PlayStation, from far away. They kill people from far away. They falsify reports from far away. They rely on open sources from far away. Dear colleagues, we are at a crossroad now. All the leaked information, particularly the engineering report by Ian Henderson, and this is very important. The engineering report contradicted the political report of the OPCW, not of the OPCW actually, of the Chief of Cabinet of the Director General of the OPCW. Two reports contradicted each other, emanating from the same organization. And for kind information, he was one of the FFM team who visited Duma, Mr. Henderson. And other relevant information which is available now on WikiLeaks. Thanks God we have WikiLeaks. And other sources. The new issue now is that the FFM had visited the site of the alleged incident, but this FFM team was prevented from participating in the preparation of the FFM Duma report, which was issued by the OPCW. It is clear that some governments were trying to repeat in Syria what had happened in Iraq. I mean using false allegations and lies related to the weapons of mass destruction to find pretexts for acts of aggression and invasion. But I assure you that we will not allow this to happen, and we call upon those member states who believe in international law and the UN Charter to raise their voices against such attempts. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished ambassador of the Syrian Arab Republic, and I have a list of speakers who wanted to make their comments, starting with the council members, and I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. China welcomes the convening of this rare formula meeting by Russia. I thank Ambassador Shu Jin, Ambassador Jafari, Director Grigoriev, and Mr. Henderson for their briefings. China listened carefully to your statements, which contain valuable information worthy of greater attention. China supports a focused discussion on the OPCW fact-finding mission report on the Duma incident, which will help all parties to better understand the facts and truth. Since the release of the Duma report, there have been many doubts about it, causing great controversy. There have been many reports about questions raised by relevant experts on the conclusions of the report in public channels. China thanks Russia for having been providing materials on the Duma incident, including holding a briefing on the Duma report in The Hague. The permanent mission of Syria has also sent multiple letters to the President of the Security Council on the issue of chemical weapons, submitting information it has gathered and expressing its concerns. Many questions have been raised from professional and technical perspectives and deserve careful discussion. Members of the Security Council, the UN Secretariat, and the OPCW should attach importance to this information. In particular, the OPCW should earnestly respond to the questions raised by state parties, support technical discussions, and properly handle differences. Deliberately avoiding discussion of the doubts would only be counterproductive. China's position on the issue of chemical weapons is consistent and clear. We firmly oppose the use of chemical weapons by any country, organization, or individual for any purpose under any circumstances. China supports the OPCW in performing its functions pursuant to the mandate emanating from the Chemical Weapons Convention. The international community should jointly uphold the professional and technical nature of the work of the OPCW, the authority and effectiveness of the CWC, and avoid politicization. Given the significance of the issue of chemical weapons, relevant investigations should be comprehensive, objective, and impartial, and the transparency of the work of the FFM should be enhanced. The investigation conclusions must be based on conclusive evidence and can stand the test of history and facts. We hope that the OPCW will draw lessons in this regard in its ensuing work, fully communicate with countries with concerns, and properly handle differences. China opposes hasty conclusions or arbitrary accusations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of China, and I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you. Ambassador, the United States categorically objects to Russia's blatant attempt to use the Security Council meeting to weaken the credibility of the OPCW and its findings on the Duma attack. This is a brazen disinformation campaign waged in advance of the anticipated release of the OPCW investigation and identification team's first report. It is also one more data point in a consistent pattern of Russian efforts to exploit the platform of the Security Council to further its own political and military agenda in Syria, propping up a murderous dictator at the expense of the Syrian people. When Russia and Syria dislike the findings of the UN or the OPCW, they use meetings like this one to undercut those organizations and the facts that they provide. We must defend the credibility and the findings of the OPCW and the UN from disinformation. If we fail to directly confront these falsehoods, the international community will be unable to help protect the Syrian people from future chemical weapons used by the Assad regime. We must not forget that the Assad regime has used chemical weapons every year since Syria's accession to the Chemical Weapons Convention in 2013. To that end, the United States stands firmly behind the OPCW fact-finding missions, the FFM March 1st, 2019 report. The FFM found that there are reasonable grounds to conclude that the use of a toxic chemical as a weapon took place. The conclusions of this report also support what the United States and others have said many times before. The Syrian regime is responsible for this heinous attack on April 7th of 2018. But in addition to Duma, we should never forget the horrific nerve agent attack by the regime on Ghouta in 2013, killing over 1,000 innocent men, women, and children, or the attacks which released toxic substances in Talminas in 2014, in Sarmin in 2015, and of course the sarin attack at Khan Sheikhoun in 2017, all committed by the Assad regime. These are the facts, full stop. The independent and impartial work of the OPCW FFM team should be commended. Their investigative work on Duma was professional, thorough, and comprehensive. The team conducted a thorough evaluation and analysis of all the information gathered, including testimony and evidence from witnesses, environmental and biomedical samples, and toxicological and ballistic analysis from experts. There is no basis for the Russia and the Assad regime to question the validity of the FFM report. The reality is that the regime sought to undermine the investigation by delaying the entry of investigators to Duma so that Assad could clean up the crime scene and tamper with evidence. In fact, it is Russia and the Assad regime that lack credibility on this issue due to their deliberate and long-running effort to obstruct the work of the inspectors. We must not forget that Syria has deliberately used chemical weapons as a military tactic to clear civilians and the armed opposition from territory outside of their control, as we have seen in Duma, Eastern Ghouta, Sarmin, and Khan Sheikhoun. Once the territory is cleared, Russian forces move in to help the regime forces solidify their control, and meanwhile, use disinformation and diplomacy to try to shield the regime from being held accountable by the international community. It is unconscionable that despite the brave efforts undertaken by the OPCW FFM to obtain the information necessary to conduct its investigation, Russia would later call into doubt the results. This is appalling treatment of an organization Russia claimed to support in the Security Council presidential statement we adopted by consensus just this past November. We must not be fooled by theatrics or meetings designed to sow confusion about whether chemical weapons are being used in Syria. And who is the culprit? It is the Assad regime. Disinformation and distractions like today's meeting hosted by the Russian Federation only serve to shield the Assad regime from being held accountable by the international community and perpetuate impunity. Russia has no credibility on the issue of chemical weapons. Not only has Russia assisted the Assad regime in covering up chemical weapons attacks in Syria, but as the Salisbury attack made clear, Russia continues to possess and use chemical weapons itself. The United States is committed to holding the Assad regime accountable for its chemical weapons, as evidenced by our Congress passing the Caesar Act just last month. Accountability and the prevention of further chemical weapons attacks in Syria are central to the Security Council's efforts to help facilitate a political solution to this conflict in line with Resolution 2254. Accountability to end impunity and prevent future uses are needed to build a new, reformed system of government in Syria that is responsive to the needs and the aspirations of the Syrian people. To do so, we must also ensure that Resolution 2111 is fully implemented, so that Assad no longer possesses chemical weapons. The United States must also take the opportunity to correct the record on the work of the Syrian Civil Defense Volunteers, commonly known as the White Helmets. The United States is proud to support the vital, life-saving work of the White Helmets, who risk their lives day in and day out to rescue their fellow Syrian civilians from attacks by the Syrian and Russian forces. These courageous White Helmets have saved over 100,000 lives. Over 100,000 lives since the Syrian conflict began in 2011. These false accusations leveled here today by the Russian Federation and our briefers are false. They are disinformation, and they are a worrying sign that the Syrian authorities and Russia are continuing to target White Helmets for future attacks. We call on all members of this Council and the broader membership to reaffirm their support for the Chemical Weapons Convention and the work of OPCW in the face of baseless attacks by Russia and the Assad regime. We look forward to the fulsome and evidence-based consideration of the IAT report in this Council in the coming days. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I wish the distinguished representative of the United States were able to be here in the room to hear in person whether it was a disinformation campaign or something different if she listened to the presentations. I know it wouldn't have changed her statement that she read out, but still. And by the way, I'm not going into polemics, but just for the record, the arrival of the OPCW inspectors to Duma was delayed not because the Russians were not letting them in, but because they were not getting clearance on security grounds due to missile attacks by the United States, France, and the UK. That what prevented the inspectors arriving as early as they could, although we were calling for that all the time. I would like to give the floor now to the distinguished representative of France.
Thank you, President. I first of all would like to thank the Federation of Russia for having organised this area-type meeting. It's quite rare that Russia do this, and I'd like to thank you because these meetings are often an opportunity for us to listen from civil society, non-governmental organisations, true NGOs, I mean, and to establish an independent opinion. This meeting is welcome because it allows us to ask the real questions. Why are we holding such a question? And it is encouraging to a certain extent. It shows that there is a problem. If there were no problem with regard to the use of chemical weapons in Syria, we wouldn't have met. In 2013, Bashar al-Assad, in a bad position, decided to gas 1,300 people on the outskirts of Damascus. Nobody contests that fact. Following on from that, we adopted Resolution 2118, precisely to try to find a solution to what had just happened and to prevent such a thing happening again. So today's discussion and the Council's work over 6 years is rooted in the fact that Bashar al-Assad, in August 2013, decided to gas 1,300 women, children, elderly people from his own country, to put himself in a stronger position. 6 years after Resolution 2118, which is on our agenda today, we still have no certainty regarding the state of Syrian chemical stockpiles, as was confirmed to us by the Director General of the OPCW last November. Such an assessment or certainty should have allowed for the dismantling of all the Syrian chemical stockpiles following the massacres committed in Ghouta. In the meantime, since 2013, chlorine attacks in Syria have continuously been reported, as well as with sarin and other chemical weapons which have been used in Syria and elsewhere. The re-emergence of chemical weapons is one of the most serious threats that we must deal with. We all thought it was finished after the end of World War I, after the war between Iran and Iraq. Thanks to Bashar al-Assad, this topic is once again in the headlines, and thanks to the Russian Federation, we are once again discussing it. Chemical weapons have been used in the UK, in Salisbury, not so long ago, in a particularly well-known attack. In this context, we must all be equal to the task. Our credibility in the defence of the regime of non-proliferation depends upon this. It is this that must bring us together, and we therefore welcome the adoption last November of a presidential statement upon a British initiative. It is therefore regrettable to note that every time the Assad regime is called into question, we see Russia's systematic attempts to protect it, sow confusion and disinformation. We saw it when Russia alone blocked the continuation of the JIM in November 2017 with 3 successive vetoes, when the JIM had identified the Assad regime as being guilty of 4 uses of chemical weapons. We saw it once again when Russia blocked the implementation of a new investigation mechanism by the Council. And we see it again when Russia steadfastly refuses to acknowledge doubts regarding the state of Syrian stockpiles when it declared them to the OPCW. We see it once again today, where there are efforts to cast doubt upon the very forum which is best able to manage the monitoring of the prohibition of the chemical weapons and their use. The OPCW, which is what I'm talking about, is fully able and competent. Its methodology should not be called into question upon the pretext that the conclusions are not in line with their desired version of the facts. As we say in France, if you want to kill your dog, you accuse it of having rabies. France therefore has every confidence in the professionalism, integrity and impartiality of the OPCW teams, and I wish to reiterate that once again. The FFM, the fact-finding mission, confirmed the use of chemical weapons in Douma, and we are now awaiting the identification of those responsible. Syria, in 2013, committed to cooperating transparently and in good faith with the OPCW, pursuant to its commitments under the Convention for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. It has not yet done so, quite simply. And it is high time that the commitments finally be upheld and that the regime finally shed light upon its stockpiles. This involves, in particular, authorizing access to its territory for the experts of the IIT, of the OPCW IIT. If the regime has nothing to hide, I ask, why is it not cooperating with the OPCW? Where are the stocks of sarin and chlorine, which have been being used for years, coming from? France will remain vigilant with regard to any risk of the use of chemical weapons, particularly in the context of a resumption of the offensive upon Idlib by the regime supported by its allies. Our determination to act remains unchanged. Those responsible for the use of chemical weapons must be held accountable, because there can be no peace without justice and with impunity. The first report of the investigation and identification team will be an important milestone in this regard. We firmly support the team, but also the IIIM in their missions. France also fully supports the international partnership to combat impunity in the use of chemical weapons, whose second anniversary we will be celebrating in a few days. All countries who so wish can join this partnership, which is neither an anti-Syrian instrument nor a club of countries. Through this commitment, countries can demonstrate their attachment to law, international stability, justice and security. That must be our priority. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. And now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican.
We would like to thank the delegation of the Russian Federation for organizing this meeting, which facilitates the exchange of opinions between member states on this topic to which we attach a great importance. We would also like to thank the rapporteurs for the briefings they provided us this afternoon. At the outset, we wish to reiterate our position of principle on our categorical condemnation of the use of toxic chemical agents as weapons in any place or under any circumstances. Their use is unjustifiable. It is a flagrant violation of international law, of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it is a threat to international peace and security, as well as to the non-proliferation and disarmament structure and regime. We regret that still, in the 21st century, and after having verified the destruction of all production sites and the chemical arsenal declared by the Syrian Arab Republic, we are still discussing the use of chemical weapons, as is unfortunately clear in the final report of the fact-finding mission of the OPCW. This concludes that indeed toxic chemical agents were used as weapons containing reactive chlorine in the incident perpetrated in Douma in April 2018. In this regard, we commend and support the work done by the fact-finding mission of the OPCW in completing a task which was marked by great challenges, including the high-risk situation on the ground and difficulties in gaining access to the locations where events had taken place without delay, inter alia. We understand that our focus must be one of continuing to deploy every effort to prevent such weapons being developed and used again. And we must promote accountability in those cases where the use of these weapons has been observed. It is therefore imperative to support the OPCW in its professional, impartial and objective work, so as to relegate chemical weapons to the past via the various exhaustive supervision and monitoring activities it does to prevent the development and use of such weapons. In the same vein, we believe that the cooperation dynamic between the Syrian authorities and the OPCW is fundamental to resolve the gaps and inconsistencies in the initial declaration, which make it impossible to verify whether the declaration is in line with the Chemical Weapons Convention. This will also facilitate the conclusion of pending investigations. Pursuant to this, we urge the Syrian authorities, as a state party to the Convention, to cooperate closely with the OPCW with a view to achieving a solution to these pending questions. We also urge it to comply with Resolution 2118 of the Security Council and other consecutive resolutions, and to abide by the decisions reached in the Conference on the Convention, including the decision in June 2018 establishing the Investigation and Identification Team. We hope that this team is finally granted access to Syrian territory so as to completely fulfill its mandate of uncovering the perpetrators of the use of chemical weapons. These heinous acts, which have cost lives, including those of women and children, and which have inflicted irreparable psychological and physical damage upon those who have survived them, should culminate in the ultimate consequences, whereby not only are the facts confirmed, but also the origin of the materials used is identified, and the perpetrators must be identified, and they in turn must be held responsible for their actions. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic, and I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and Grenadines.
Thank you for the floor, Ambassador. The weaponizing of toxic chemicals is unquestionably one of the great threats to international peace and security. The use of chemical weapons anywhere, by anyone, and under any circumstances constitutes a reprehensible violation of international law and necessitates condemnation by the international community. Chemical weapons do not discriminate between combatants and civilians, and their effects are horrifying. Perpetrators must not be allowed to operate with impunity. We must hold them accountable. St. Vincent and the Grenadines therefore supports the mandate of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and all efforts made to ensure that applied science and technology is only used for peace, progress, and prosperity of all humanity. The OPCW bears the responsibility of ensuring that all facets and activities of the organization, including the work of the fact-finding mission, the identification and investigation team, and the declaration assessment team, are impartial, transparent, and not politicized. The OPCW must be above reproach. Anything less erodes trust, undermines its efforts, and renders it ineffective. For the organization to thrive and be a well-functioning multilateral body which is able to fulfill its mandated purpose, state parties to Chemical Weapons Convention must have faith in its composition, and its findings must be able to withstand rigorous scrutiny. Successful implementation of Security Council Resolution 2118 requires and in fact mandates the full cooperation of the Syrian Arab Republic with the OPCW. The Syrian government must therefore adhere to its international obligations and allow the OPCW teams unimpeded access to conduct their work. Undoubtedly, cooperation becomes strained where deficits in trust exist. As such, the OPCW must consistently strive to improve and strengthen its internal structure and remain committed to upholding its own high standards, which merited the award of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2013. Additionally, the importance that the role of dialogue plays must always be borne in mind. The perspectives of the Syrian government should always be given due consideration when adjudicating such issues that touch and concern their territorial integrity. Without the elements of cooperation and dialogue, there can be no trust. Without trust, the implementation of the resolution will never be fully realized. In the Security Council on the 9th of January, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Honorable Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, noted, and I quote, "One of the essential contributions to be made to by small states like ours is the tireless advocacy for timeless principles enshrined in international law. With no ideological or geostrategic axis to grind, we consider it our solemn obligation not only to articulate these principles, but to ensure that they are applied consistently and upheld in the international community as universal truths, rather than selective, uneven, and unpredictable tools for further hegemonic power or great power ambition," end of quote. In this case, it requires us identifying and addressing shortcomings where we find them in our quest to prevent the development, stockpiling, transfer, and use of chemical weapons to better protect the future of humanity. Thank you.
thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and Grenadines, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Vasily. I would like to thank the Russian Federation for taking the initiative to hold this area formula meeting entitled Implementation of Security Council Resolution 2118 of 2013, the OPCW FFM report on Duma. We thank the briefers for their briefings. We support, in general, the holding of area formula meetings as part of the effort to hold a constructive dialogue, to listen to opinions from the international community, respected opinions on matters of international peace and security. Our participation in this meeting is in line with our principled position regarding the non-proliferation of WMDs. The use of chemical weapons is illegal, is morally reprehensible, and therefore it is our moral and legal responsibility to eliminate chemical weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, while eliminating the existential threat they represent to humanity. Security Council Resolution 2118 of 2013 was adopted unanimously by the Council. It sets a clear framework to ensure the complete elimination of the chemical weapons of the Syrian Arab Republic, while avoiding the emergence of such chemical weapons in Syria under international supervision. The resolution also sets out the necessary measures to ensure compliance by the Syrian government with its obligations under the resolution and under the CWC as a state party, through the monitoring activities conducted by the OPCW. Tunisia supports the activities of the OPCW, including its monitoring of the implementation of the CWC in Syria, which led to the dismantlement of the Syrian chemical program. We believe that the inspectors and experts of the OPCW must be professional and independent. The FFM plays an important and vital role in implementing Resolution 2118, especially that there are reports of the use of toxic chemicals as weapons in Syria. We look forward to strengthened cooperation and dialogue between the Syrian government and the Technical Secretariat of the OPCW to resolve all outstanding issues. Mr. President, the reports of the FFM are highly important, especially given their impact on the attribution of responsibility on the use of chemical weapons, which is the responsibility of the investigation and identification team of the OPCW. We regret that the Security Council could not be united on the report of the FFM in Syria, including the final report of the fact-finding mission on the incident of the use of toxic chemicals as weapons in Duma, issued on March 1st, 2019. The reports of the FFM must not be subject to controversy, so that the OPCW can continue its work in an objective and impartial manner. The OPCW contributes to the maintenance of international peace and security through multilateral action. Therefore, it is important not to send a negative message to the international community, namely that the Council could not be united on this issue. Such a message would undermine the credibility, transparency, integrity, and independence of the organization. In closing, I reiterate Tunisia's position, namely that there is a need to solve the crisis in Syria and to end this controversy by accelerating the political process through a UN-mandated dialogue that would ensure the sovereignty and unity of Syria according to Resolution 2254. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia, and I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I would like to thank the Russian Federation for organizing this area meeting on an item of such importance for my country. Indeed, combating chemical weapons, which we firmly condemn the use of, is a priority for Belgium. The current situation of the re-emergence of chemical weapons, in particular in Syria, unfortunately proves that this fight against the use of chemical weapons is not over. It is therefore important to continue to draw attention to this issue. As a member of the Convention on Chemical Weapons, Belgium aspires to a world free of chemical weapons. We believe that this is a common goal. The central nature of the OPCW, of the CWC, has once again been reiterated through the presidential statement by this Council last November. Our commitment to a world free of nuclear weapons is not a theoretical aim. If we wish to pursue non-proliferation, it is imperative to be consistent in our practice. The case of Syria is of capital importance, which is why Belgium fully supports the full implementation of Resolution 2118 of the Security Council. Firstly, the reports, notably those produced by the JIM and the OPCW investigation team, showed that chemical weapons were used during the Syrian conflict. The fact that Syria has not fully acquitted itself of its obligations under the Convention, and that 6 years after its joining, this technical secretariat is still unable to fill all the gaps, inconsistencies and divergences identified in the Syrian declaration is alarming. This is not a technical detail. This lack of clarity opens the door to a possible future use of chemical weapons. We call upon Syria to clarify all pending issues with the OPCW, which is the only organization whose mandate is the supervision of this process. Moreover, if the OPCW is to function properly, all suspicion of any incident must be the subject of an in-depth investigation. We support the fact-finding mission and the report that this mission has already published regarding the situation on the resumed use of chemical weapons in Syria, and we call for the finalization of investigations underway. Finally, impunity regarding the use of chemical weapons threatens not only the Chemical Weapons Convention, but also it fundamentally raises questions of international security. We believe that the decision taken by the Conference of State Parties in June 2018 to allow the OPCW to identify those responsible for chemical acts of war is an important step, and we fully support the OPCW in the implementation of that decision which was taken following the OPCW decision-making rules. We eagerly await the first report. By way of conclusion, Belgium welcomes the work done by the OPCW, and we reiterate our full trust in the leadership of DG Arias and the professionalism, integrity and devotion of the Technical Secretariat, as well as the rigour of its internal procedures. We also commit, as a member of the Executive Council from May 2020, to ensure that the organisation can focus in a neutral way on its main mission, which is the elimination of chemical weapons. We are fully against any initiatives which seek to politicise or destabilise the organisation or call into question its conclusions. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium, and I would like to give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the repeated use of chemical weapons has been one of the most appalling aspects of the Syrian conflict. Throughout the conflict, now going on for 9 years, chemical weapons have been used to serve strategic aims to suppress opposition with devastating humanitarian consequences for the Syrian people. The OPCW fact-finding mission that has most rigorous guidelines for investigations have repeatedly confirmed the use of toxic chemical agents as a weapon in Syria, including in Douma in April 2018. Further, between 2015 and 2017, the joint investigative mechanism that was tasked by the Security Council to identify the perpetrators concluded that the Syrian Arab Republic was 4 times and ISIL twice responsible for using chemical weapons. Considering the inhumane and indiscriminate effect the chemical weapons have, these findings and actions are staggering. Estonia condemns the use of chemical weapons in the strongest terms. Any use of such weapons is a grave violation of international law. The use of chemical weapons in armed conflict amounts to a war crime and crime against humanity. Yet, regrettably, so far, chemical weapons attacks in Syria have been largely committed with impunity. Since the Security Council renewed the JIM mandate in 2016 for 1 year, it has been unable to agree on any collective action regarding establishing an impartial and independent instrument for attributing the chemical weapons attacks in Syria. All attempts in the Council to move towards accountability for the use of chemical weapons in Syria have been blocked by the Russian Federation's veto. Impunity cannot be an option. This is the reason Estonia, along with a large majority of the state parties of the Conference to the Chemical Weapons, supported the decision to establish a mechanism to investigate and identify the perpetrators of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. We have been pleased to hear about the progress made by the IIT, and we look forward to its first report. The recent decision of the General Assembly to fund the international, impartial, and independent mechanism from the UN regular budget shows further the large support and need to address accountability for the crimes against international law committed in Syria. Mr. Chair, it is unfortunate that this meeting has not been convened with the aim for the Security Council to discuss how to put an end to these crimes and move forward with our accountability measures. Instead, the aim has been to deflect blame, increase impunity, and undermine the authority of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the OPCW. This disinformation campaign undermines the well-established norm against the use of chemical weapons. Let me be clear. Estonia fully supports and trusts the independent, impartial, and professional work of the FFM, undertaken in difficult and dangerous circumstances. There is nothing that has given us any reason to doubt in the conclusions of the Douma report. We also reject accusations against the White Helmets and commend their self-sacrificing humanitarian work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Estonia, and I would like to give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the Russian Federation for organizing this area formula meeting on an issue that attracts great attention from the international community. We welcome efforts of all concerned parties in the implementation of the CWC and related Security Council resolution, including Resolution 2118. Regarding Douma incident, we noted the efforts of OPCW Technical Secretariat and Syria in urgently dispatching an FFM team to the site. We also noted the complicated developments and security situation during those days. We took note of the postponement of the FFM team deployment, which combined with other factors might have affected the investigation. Vietnam consistently supports all efforts towards non-proliferation and disarmament of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons. We strongly condemn any use of chemical weapons in any form, by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances, or for any reason. As state party to the Convention on Chemical Weapons, Vietnam strongly supports its full implementation. We would like to underline that it is the state parties that bear the primary responsibility to implement obligation under the Convention. In this regard, we support the OPCW in discharging its mandate, including its technical support to member state parties in implementing the Convention. We are of the view that the OPCW's work, including its investigations into alleged uses of chemical weapons, must be conducted in a comprehensive, objective, impartial, and professional manner without interference or politicization, in full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of state parties. Together with other council members, we look forward to receiving upcoming reports of those OPCW. I have one question. What are the steps that concerned parties should take to ensure that the investigation are conducted in a comprehensive, balanced, and objective manner? Thank you.
I think the distinguished representative of Vietnam will come to the questions later, but now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Colleagues, over the last 2 decades, through the Chemical Weapons Convention and the OPCW, we've collectively made great strides towards a world free of chemical weapons and the prohibition of their use. However, in recent years, we've become aware of states once again using these dangerous and destructive weapons, and my own country has the sad distinction of being one of 4 countries since 2013 to experience chemical weapons use. Today, though it has been a bit difficult to follow always the panel's sometimes contradictory arguments, we are being asked to examine the events that took place during and after the chemical weapons attack in Duma in April 2018. We've seen elaborately constructed arguments, as with previous so-called briefings. Those arguments have failed to convince the OPCW membership in The Hague, and we are sure that they will not convince member states here in New York. They have been masquerading as fact, and their clear aim is to protect the Syrian regime from any accountability for its chemical weapons usage by undermining credible and independent investigations. Russian time and energy would have been better served, as would international peace and security, by persuading the Syrian authorities to resolve the gaps in their CW declarations and cooperate with the DAT and OPCW. Since all the Security Council support the work of the OPCW, as set out in the presidential statement that many speakers today have mentioned, that work should have been a priority. And in UNSCR 2118, this Council expressed its strong conviction that those individuals responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria should be held accountable. And other speakers today have set out how that led to a UN joint investigative mechanism which was independent and expert. The Russian Federation closed this down when it found that the Syrian Arab Republic was responsible for the sarin attack in Khan Sheikhoun. It has sought to block all action to OPCW and in the Security Council to identify and hold to account those responsible for chemical weapons use, and was even caught carrying out a cyber attack against OPCW in The Hague. On Duma, the panel asked some, quote, massive questions. The answers, I'm afraid, do not lie in the analysis of Russian scientific experts, much as I respect Russian science, given Russian government support for the Syrian authorities, including condoning the use by those authorities of chemical weapons. One does not give the fire investigation to the arsonist who pours fuel on the flames. And as for the, quote, undeniable and unequivocal, quote, evidence presented today, Mr. Chairman, I have to say, someone in Russia is very fond of English literature. Specifically, they are very fond of Lewis Carroll. During Salisbury discussion, we had many quotes from Alice in Wonderland. Now, with the Duma presentation today, we have Humpty Dumpty. When I use a word, said Humpty Dumpty, it means just what I choose it to mean. This is what we have heard today. We have heard the Russians putting their own spin and their own version on facts established by an independent body trusted by the international community to do its work. This is, frankly, a shameful response to the very real horrors on the ground in Syria that ordinary Syrians experience. It is fiddling while Syria burns, and those of us who have seen the WHO and other photographs of children and others suffering from chlorine and chemical weapons attacks know that that phrase is not to be used lightly. Mr. Chairman, the Technical Secretariat of the OPCW produced a thorough and well-evidenced final report on Duma, and as part of its investigation and reaching its conclusions, the FFM did some very thorough work. It collected environmental samples in the presence of representatives of the Syrian authorities, which were key to the overall finding of the presence of molecular chlorine. It analysed all relevant available material and, where necessary, consulted independent experts in mechanical engineering, ballistics, metallurgy, who use specialised computer modelling techniques to provide qualified and competent assessments. And it provided detailed briefings and written responses to comments and queries sent to it by the Syrian authorities and the Russian Federation after the final report was issued. It came to a very clear conclusion that chlorine had been used as a weapon after considering all the evidence in the round over a period of many months and on the back of detailed scientific analysis. Now, I know we heard from Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson's papers appear to reflect a personal view. Of course, there are bound to be robust exchanges of views with voices differing from others in any scientific process, but what counts is the final considered assessment. The FFM formally consulted 3 separate ballistic experts who all came to the same conclusion. So let us be in no doubt that there was a chemical weapons attack in Duma on 7 April 2018, and we are firmly of the view, along with others, that the Syrian regime was responsible. The Russian Federation's argument that OPCW's investigation was somehow designed to approve retrospectively the military action taken by UK, France and the US is laughable. I recall that the Russian draft Security Council resolution that tried to condemn the action taken by those 3 countries received only 3 votes. Mr. Chairman, I gather that a lot was said by you and by others before I arrived in this debate about the United Kingdom. I wasn't expecting the United Kingdom to feature so prominently in today's aria, but as OPCW has concluded, and as I mentioned earlier, we have been the victim of a chemical weapons attack in Salisbury from which 1 person sadly died, others were rendered very sick, and a whole city was put at risk. We have assessed that this attack was carried out by the GRU. So it's not a question of crying wolf. European and other countries expelled more than 130 diplomats, Russian diplomats, as a result of that attack. These are very serious matters. The world would be better served if Russia, as a P5 member, joined us in upholding the work of OPCW and bringing to an end, once and for all, the risk that the Syrian authorities might again use chemical weapons. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, and I don't think that it is appropriate for a chair of the area formula to engage in exchanges with countries that make their statements, and I respect that right. On Humpty Dumpty, I just wanted to say one thing, that Humpty Dumpty, which, as we know, sat on the wall and, as we all know, had a great fall, so that no king's horses or king's men could put him Humpty, no Dumpty again. I mean, that is exactly what happened to the FFM report. Exactly. There was one report initially, and then there was a Humpty Dumpty, and we had another report, which is the reason why we are discussing it here today. I will not go into the discussion of individual episodes that my distinguished British colleague raised. I don't think the meeting is about that. I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany now.
Thank you very much. As you have mentioned at the beginning, you said that you would take us on an exciting journey, and I would like to take up actually the picture of literature that you and the British ambassador took up. I was also thinking, when I was listening to the panel, I was thinking of Alice in Wonderland. You know, this belongs in literature to the genre of fantasy and absurdity. But while Alice in Wonderland is great fiction, what we heard today was very, very sad fiction. On the journey, we just had a discussion or just had a mentioning of the one journey you already took us, and this was Salisbury, and I can only repeat what my British colleague just said. So on the journey, or as the representative of the Assad government said, the story didn't start in Duma, and I can only subscribe to this. The story is that no member of the podium opposed it, refuted it, but also didn't mention it on something when we talk about about chemical weapons, that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons against its own population. And the French ambassador earlier described the fate of the 1,300 people, and we must never forget this, and one should explain and one should say what is done about this. And until today, also, as it was mentioned before, Syria has not completed its declaration with regard to the compliance of CWC. There is still no explanation on many of the stocks. Ambassador Shulgin, there was, maybe it was unintentional, but there was one phrase I appreciated in your statement. It was the first time I heard from a Russian ambassador something positive about the white helmets, because you said that they supply medical aid to the population. This is very positive, and I would like at this stage also to repeat what has been done before, also by my Estonian colleague, our respect for the work of the white helmets and their self-sacrificing work. Now, Ambassador Shulgin, you also mentioned that photographs have disappeared. What hasn't disappeared are the photos of pictures taken in Syrian prisons. We have these victims and we have this proof of torture, of murder being conducted on many hundred thousands of Syrians. And again,
it is too bad that the story or the journey that was presented didn't mention this. But going back to this journey, we'll go back to Duma at the end, but the journey also leads us to The Hague, the seat of OPCW. Also, again, it was not mentioned on the podium that just a few days after Duma, the GRU that was just mentioned actually staged a cyber attack on OPCW. And this shows how far Russia is willing to go to undermine the integrity of OPCW. And I would like also here again to confirm from Germany the full confidence in the technical expertise, the professionalism, the impartiality, and the independence of OPCW. And as our colleague from St. Vincent and Grenadines just reminded us, the organization received the Peace Nobel Prize. Mr. Grigoriev, you have been here before. You were in October here in a meeting that was organized by the mission, and we remember this meeting because you didn't know the story that was in the New York Times about the Syrian-Russian attacks on medical facilities in Idlib and in eastern Syria. I looked a bit at what your institute is publishing, and you belong to the school of Russian scientists that believe that Ukraine invaded Russia and not Russia Ukraine, when I read stories about Ukrainian army torture of Donbas region residents. Now, going back on our journey, and here the journey leads us here to New York. We have here 3 vetoes by Russia on JIM. We have here the efforts until this December to stop the IIIM mechanism in the 5th Committee, and also your efforts to stop IIT. And there in the attack on the IIT, we again were witness of fake news insofar as it was suggested that the IIT didn't come into existence legally. I want to remind member states that the decision to establish the WIT was the mandate to identify those responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria was taken by a majority vote in full accordance with the CWC and the rules of procedure of the OPCW, and this has also been confirmed by the Office of the Legal Advisor of the OPCW. Let me finish and go back to Duma. And here again, we had a lot of questioning of Duma, and we heard before also the responses to this. Let me remind you that the results of the fact-finding mission report are based on ballistic analysis, comprehensive on-site investigations, environmental and biomedical samples, toxicological analysis, and witnesses' interviews. Among them, 129 samples, interviews not with a handful but with 39 witnesses, 206 media files from witnesses and many more collected by the FFM, 42 open source accounts, as well as 7 note verbal by the Syrian Arab Republic. Let me also go on the journey briefly, I forgot to mention this before, to Geneva. In parallel to the FFM, the Commission of Inquiry set up by the UN Human Rights Council also examined the events in Duma and independently came to the same conclusions that chemical weapons were used in Duma. So what we need is that we hold responsible those who committed these crimes, that they do not go unpunished, and therefore we are very much looking forward to the WIT report, which we believe will help to provide important contribution to hold the perpetrators accountable. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany. I don't think you will be able to find in open sources a quote from Mr. Grigoriev that Ukraine invaded Russia. If you do, then share it with me. I will be very, very surprised to see it. But you will definitely find in the open press accounts not just by Mr. Grigoriev, on the torture that happens in the southeast Ukraine. That is not something that we invented. That is in the open press. We know what the Ukrainian army and the national brigades and special services are doing to people who are in Ukrainian prisons. They are being tortured there. There are plenty of evidence about that. And if you are interested, I can provide you with some additional, an extra. Yes, please.
What I questioned was, his scientific approach, and if you can also from the list provide me on the crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine, Russian soldiers or Russian mercenaries, what they did, and if that is also if that is also in his file, then I, of course, am happy to look at this differently.
All right. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Niger.
Merci.
Thank you, Vasily. After having allowed me to discover the sofa talks, thank you now for allowing this new member of the Council to take part in this difficult voyage with many stumbling blocks on the way regarding the use of chemical weapons in Syria. I would also like to thank the rapporteurs for their comprehensive briefings and hope that after these exchanges we have heard, truth will eventually be revealed. The use of chemical weapons and all other unconventional weapons is an intolerable act which Niger condemns everywhere in the world and also in Syria. What happened in Duma is not acceptable, and the pursuit of truth must go there. Although since 2013 many efforts have been deployed by the United Nations to attribute responsibility in the many cases of the use of such weapons, it is regrettable to note today that all these efforts, which resulted in the adoption by unanimity by the Council of Resolution 2118, have not allowed us to establish responsibility for the atrocities committed in a way which is acceptable to all. My delegation therefore calls upon the Syrian government and all parties to the conflict to cooperate in good faith with the investigation and identification team of the OPCW to move forward in this file. The investigation and composition of all teams investigating such reported incidents must be inclusive to avoid conclusions suffering from the same fate as those of other mechanisms which have gone before. The lack of consensus on how to deal with the question of the use of chemical weapons in Syria is a hindrance to accountability amongst the true perpetrators of these acts, and it leaves the victims, most of whom are women and children, with no recourse. This, unfortunately, will also deal a blow to the credibility of the OPCW in ensuring compliance with the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons in other conflicts. This could also weaken the Chemical Weapons Convention, which would be a great shame, given how current and relevant this convention remains. My delegation remains convinced that the resolution of this thorny problem of the use of chemical weapons in Syria, by allowing the unequivocal identification of those responsible, will strengthen the OPCW's authority. The OPCW must be respected, and this will greatly contribute to consolidating trust between all players. This will serve to bolster progress in the political and humanitarian dimensions of the crisis. In this regard, differences of opinion between members of the Council must take second place to a serene technical analysis of the results of investigations completed, so as to guarantee the integrity of the verification regime and hence the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons. To conclude, I wish to recall that any delay in resolving this file will merely prolong the despair of the Syrian victims who are awaiting justice. This must compel us to act accordingly and with full responsibility in line with the mandate conferred upon us by the United Nations Charter of protecting Syrian civilians. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank the distinguished representative of Niger, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, let me at the outset thank the mission of Russian Federation for organizing this meeting. And I would also like to thank all the briefers for their presentations. My delegation believes that all alleged chemical incidents must undertake transparent, comprehensive, and impartial investigations with the aim at having conclusive evidences in line with and based on credible facts. This is indeed key to prevent any doubts and or multi-interpretation which would not be beneficial in moving forward the issue of chemical weapons in Syria. To this end, we need to ensure the safety and security of the OPCW personnel in conducting their mandated tests on the ground, and this includes the FMM team. We view that the integrity of the OPCW team is critical, and we trust that the OPCW will do its utmost in this regard. Mr. Chairman, before concluding, let me reiterate our position that Indonesia condemns any use of chemical weapons by any country, organization, group, or states, or person in any circumstances. The use of chemical weapons is unjustifiable and intolerable anywhere at any time. Therefore, the Council needs to continue supporting the enhanced dialogues and substantive as well as constructive cooperation between the OPCW and the government of Syrian Arab Republic. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and also thank you for organizing this meeting and for the panel, for the information that was provided and to get the opportunity to hear the information that was provided. Let me start out by indicating that we would like to reiterate that as South Africa we condemn any use of chemical weapons by anyone under any circumstance. South Africa believes that no cause can ever justify the use of any weapon of mass destruction by any actor under any circumstance. We oppose any use of chemical weapons and are committed to our international obligations as a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention and a member of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Mr. Chairman, the use of chemical weapons undermines the international norm against the production, use, and stockpiling of chemical weapons established under the Chemical Weapons Convention. In South Africa's view, the alleged use of chemical weapons by a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention is a very serious matter that would constitute a material breach of obligations under the Convention. Having said that, it's imperative that the Chemical Weapons Convention states parties must continue to have confidence in the OPCW's impartiality as the only technically competent international authority in its area of work, and that there should be no political interference in its work. The CWC states parties should therefore unite in preserving the international norm against chemical weapons and adherence to the provisions of the Chemical Weapons Convention and its consistent and non-discriminatory implementation. South Africa will continue to work towards preventing the politicization of the relevant multilateral instruments, whilst at the same time holding states parties accountable for any non-compliance with their obligations based on incontrovertible evidence. It's of paramount importance that the OPCW, including its fact-finding mission in Syria, remains a credible body that's depoliticized and not susceptible to political manipulation. Reports released by the OPCW should be a true reflection of the investigations undertaken by the organization. Without this assurance, the credibility of the organization and the work it does will be undermined. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa, and I would like now to give the floor to those delegations that requested to speak. And first, I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada, who asked to speak on behalf of the CANS group.
Thank you very much. As you noted, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of the following countries: Australia, New Zealand, and my own country, Canada. CAN's countries remain deeply concerned about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. It is civilians who bore and continue to bear the consequences of these attacks. We continue to express our unwavering and steadfast support for the OPCW, the Director General, and the Technical Secretariat. We are confident that OPCW officials have conducted themselves with professionalism, impartiality, integrity, expertise, and analytical rigor in their various missions aimed at investigating reports of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Indeed, Technical Secretariat staff put their lives in danger to collect the evidence and report on the circumstances behind chemical weapons attacks. Our confidence extends as well to UN High Representative Nakamitsu, who has conducted herself with absolute integrity. Regarding the leaks of messages within the OPCW, we are deeply concerned with these developments and reaffirm the importance of information security for the OPCW. We look forward to the 6 February briefing by the Director General and other senior Technical Secretariat officials on its independent investigation on these matters, for which the OPCW hired external experts last summer. In our view, this is an issue best handled in The Hague by the Technical Secretariat and the permanent representatives to the OPCW. Tous les États parties devraient s'efforcer.
All states parties should work to bolster and strengthen the OPCW as much as possible. In a national capacity, I will highlight Canada's recent contribution of $746,000 to support safety, security, and technical upgrades to the OPCW's facilities. This will include improvements to electronic data access control.
Canada emphatically rejects the allegations made against the White Helmets. Any use of chemical weapons is an abhorrent breach of international law. Perpetrators must be held to account. CAN's countries urge all states parties to find common ground and work together to protect the impartiality, independence, and capacity of the OPCW to uphold the international rules-based order. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation thanks the delegation of the Russian Federation for convening this meeting on a very important matter. It's one of the crucial crises in the region, and the use of chemical weapons in Syria. There were so many debates on how to address this issue appropriately. I would like to thank all briefers. Mr. President, Egypt condemns the use of all weapons of mass destruction or the threat of their use by any party under any circumstances. Egypt has long proved the credibility of its position on that dossier by supporting all relevant international effort, including supporting the effort made by the Security Council on the chemical weapons file in Syria during the non-permanent membership of Egypt in 2016-2017. Egypt has long been keen to support the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1540 to prevent non-state actors from possessing all types of weapons of mass destruction or their delivery. Meanwhile, we reiterate that any international investigation on cases where chemical weapons were used or identification of their perpetrators must abide by the highest levels of accuracy, impartiality, and objectivity. The evidence must be in line with an agreed-upon international investigation mechanism without any politicization or interference in the investigation. Regrettably, the Security Council is still unable to reach clear consensual procedures on their investigation process in the case of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. We can see further polarization within the Security Council and the OPCW, including the question marks raised on the content of some relevant reports or certain incidents of chemical weapons use in Syria, questions surrounding their impartiality and objectivity which undermine relevant international effort. It also limits the ability of the Security Council to maintain international peace and security. Such situation would be a normal extension to the failure of the Security Council over the past years to achieve any progress on implementing the content of Resolution 487 of 1981 and Resolution 687 of 1991 on establishing a Middle East zone free from weapons of mass destruction and other weapons or nuclear weapons. It could have avoided Syria and the region from the atrocities of using weapons of mass destruction. Mr. President, we follow up with concern the information presented by Syria and other countries over years on the fact that some countries are providing terrorist groups and illegitimate armed groups with chemical weapons and providing them training also on their use. We believe that such information presented by the government of Syria, the last of which was included in the letter sent from the permanent representative of Syria to the Secretary General on the 13th of January, are of great importance. We must ensure the credibility of and the authenticity of this information, especially the fact that some countries have moved certain terrorist elements from Syria to Libya over the past few months. Egypt has warned against this fact on the 30th of September 2019. We urged the Security Council and its relevant entities to take the necessary measures to immediately put a halt to the influx of foreign terrorist fighters from Syria and to hold the responsible entities accountable to such influx. To conclude, the Syrian crisis is going through an important point that requires the unity of the Security Council and the international community to address all matters that might impact our path towards reaching a sustainable settlement to this issue so that we can bring about stability and security to Syria and ensure its stability, unity, and security and territorial integrity. We must address all measures for a political solution in line with the provisions of Security Council Resolution 2254. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt, and now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'd like to appreciate your efforts for convening this meeting, which can shed a light to the ongoing facts about the issues of use of chemical weapons in Syria. These kind of meetings can invalidate the fabricated stories that have tried to mislead the international community on truth and the required approaches. The fact that government of Syrian Arab Republic, while combating the terrorist groups, are facing the illegal foreign military interventions, took concrete decisions and managed to fulfill its obligations on destruction of its chemical weapons and related facilities is of utmost importance that must be duly noted. It is also the fact that the OPCW Technical Secretariat has verified the destruction of those weapons and also destruction of all 27 declared chemical weapons production facilities. Another fact is that Syria has continued to work with the OPCW to solve any remaining issues for which it has held several rounds of talks with the OPCW and has submitted more than 70 monthly reports along with many supplementary explanations. The list of facts is continuing. Syria itself has been a victim of use of chemical weapons and has invited the OPCW FFM to investigate on the chemical attacks that have taken place against Syrian military and civilians. It has received several FFM delegations and has cooperated with them to prove that it has been a victim of chemical weapons attacks by terrorist groups. We believe that given this remarkable cooperation on both issues, namely destruction of chemical weapons as well as investigation of alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria, the international community should commend these facts. However, what we have seen is the opposite, and it is the politicized pressure of some players to not only ignore the said facts, but also to illegally interfere in this situation. The US, UK, and France missile attack on 14th of April 2018 to Syrian airbase is just one example in this context. On the other hand, we have observed reports of the FFM which have been far from meeting a normal expectation of such reports. The reports that shall be completely impartial and professional, but they have failed to meet those minimum requirements. One clear example is the FFM report on the incident in Douma on 7th of April 2018. Based on the provisions of the CWC and the procedures set forth for the investigations and inspections of alleged use of chemical weapons, their report or reports shall be factual, objective, transparent, and based on professionalism and impartiality. We, as an active state party to the CWC and a major victim of systematic use of chemical weapons in the contemporary history, are strongly concerned about any manipulation in the composition of the FFM and their reports. In the same vein, I would like to emphasize on the necessity of observing the policy and principles of confidentiality by both the OPCW Technical Secretariat and also its staff. No breach of these principles should be ignored. Rather, they should be tackled seriously and based on the set rules, and the state parties should be informed about the result. These concerns should be dealt with seriously by ensuring the application of all legal and professional requirements based on the CWC as well as the decisions of the OPCW policy-making organs. Otherwise, the whole credibility of the OPCW and its various reports will be at serious jeopardy. I would like to reiterate our strong conviction that in order to guarantee the integrity and credibility of the OPCW, the activities of FFM should be of technical and depoliticized nature based on validated information received from authorized and reliable sources and carried out professionally and impartially. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Chairman, Costa Rica would like to thank the Russian Federation for convening this meeting and opening this item for open discussion this afternoon. We have come here to listen, take notes, and we have done both of those things with great attention to everybody who's spoken. The efforts of the international community have borne fruit 20 years ago in generating the Convention Against the Use of Chemical Weapons. As a result, the creation of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to ensure the consolidation and strict compliance with this important convention, so important to the international community. As has already been said, it even earned the OPCW the granting of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2013. We therefore believed that the dark night of the use of chemical weapons had come to an end. Some even sought innovative mechanisms to modernize the work of the organization and make it valid for a world without chemical weapons. Unfortunately, the illusion and the hope of this world evaporated very quickly, and we are still today continuing to discuss the use of such weapons. The legal instrument, the Convention, and the operative ability of the Operation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to implement this Convention have come through these discussions. And this, at least, is a step forward. They have been unharmed by these discussions. President, Costa Rica always supports multilateralism and commends the work of the organization. And we recognize the report of its Director General to the 24th session of the Conference of State Parties. We do hope to see this soon, the prompt publication of the report of the IIT. We wish, ultimately, to have the identification and responsibility attributed to those who have perpetrated such heinous crimes. We cannot accept responsibility being evaded, responsibility to comply with the mandates of the Convention. This is the hope that we have for humanity and that humanity itself does hold. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Croatia.
Thank you. Croatia holds the presidency of the Council of the European Union, and I speak on behalf of its 28 member states. The Chemical Weapons Convention is a key instrument of the global non-proliferation and disarmament architecture. It is one of the most successful disarmament regimes in the world, ensuring that more than 97% of the world's declared stockpile of chemical weapons has been destroyed. It should be needless to point out the enormous human suffering that the world has been spared thanks to this development. However, the use of chemical weapons in recent years has severely undermined the universal prohibition against the use of these weapons. Preventing impunity and re-emergence of chemical weapons is crucial to preserve the integrity of the established norms. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and its Technical Secretariat have played an indispensable role in ensuring the effective implementation of the Convention. The European Union acknowledges the professionalism and impartiality of the OPCW Technical Secretariat. We have full confidence in the capacity to implement the decisions and tasks given by the states parties, and we reiterate our firm support for its efforts to effectively implement the Chemical Weapons Convention. The European Union also underlines the complementarity of the work of the OPCW and the United Nations and appreciates the Director General's recent visit to the United Nations Security Council on 5 November 2019 to share information on the OPCW activities. Regretting the fact that the UN Security Council could not agree to prolong the mandate of the joint investigative mechanism, the European Union reiterates its strong support for the work of the fact-finding mission in Syria. We stress once again our full trust in the professionalism, impartiality and objectivity of the findings of the mission's reports, including regarding the incident of alleged use of toxic chemical as a weapon in Douma. The report concludes that evaluation and analysis of all information gathered provide reasonable grounds to believe that the use of toxic chemical as a weapon took place. This report may lead to further steps to identify the perpetrators of these reprehensible attacks. The European Union reiterates that any use of chemical weapons anywhere, at any time, by anyone, under any circumstances, is unacceptable. Those responsible for the use of chemical weapons should be held accountable, always. The work of the international, impartial and independent mechanisms is in this regard of utmost importance. The EU fully supports its work and calls on all stakeholders to fully cooperate with it. we commend the OPCW Technical Secretariat for the establishment of the Investigation and Identification Team as mandated by the declaration addressing the threat from chemical weapons use. We look forward to the issuing of the team's first report and the next steps towards identifying those responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. As regards the elimination of the Syrian chemical weapons program, the European Union expresses great concern about the Syrian regime's continued breach of its obligation as a state party to the Convention due to its failure to provide a complete declaration of its chemical weapons program and its failure to destroy all of its chemical weapons and chemical weapons production facilities. We urge the Syrian Arab Republic to fully cooperate with OPCW Technical Secretariat as required under the Chemical Weapons Convention and relevant UN Security Council resolution. And we urge all members of the Security Council to fully support and respect the work of the OPCW Technical Secretariat. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Croatia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Japan expresses its strong concern that from 2012, we have frequently seen the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Any use of chemical weapons cannot be tolerated under any circumstance. The impunity of those who have used the chemical weapons must not be overlooked as well. Japan commends that the fact-finding mission, despite operating in a difficult environment, has been realizing an objective and assessment as possible, including on its final report regarding the case of Duma in April 2018. Japan supports the decision of the fourth special session of the Conference of the State Parties in June 2018 regarding frameworks to identify the perpetrators of the use of chemical weapons, adopted according to the decision-making rules specified in the CWC, and thus being legitimate. Japan also supports the investigation and identification team established last year based on this decision. Both the FFM and IIT have a significant role in deterring the use of chemical weapons in Syria. As was the case for the previous FFM, their investigations must be fair and based on scientific evidence. To enable this, the international community should continue to support the OPCW in its maintenance of objectivity and impartiality. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons plays a central role in ensuring respect for the established provisions under the Chemical Weapons Convention. The report of the fact-finding mission, the FFM, on the incident of the use of chemical weapons in Duma, Syria, on the 7th of April 2018, drew alarming conclusions. Following an in-depth, impartial and professional investigation, the FFM confirmed that the evaluation and analysis of all of the gathered information demonstrated reasonable grounds to conclude that a toxic chemical product had been used as a weapon. Switzerland is concerned over the doubts created over the validity of the OPCW's conclusions in carrying out its mission, in particular in the incident in Duma. We have full confidence in the work and conclusions of the OPCW, which, in the context of the FFM, the Declaration Assessment Team, and the Joint Investigative Mechanism, the OPCW and the UN, has always carried out its work in a professional and impartial fashion in strict respect for its mandate. Switzerland thanks the FFM for the work it has done in difficult circumstances. We underscore that any use of chemical weapons is contrary to international law and is prohibited in any circumstances. Impunity for those crimes is unacceptable. The international community must act with determination to ensure that those responsible are held accountable for their actions and brought to justice. In this respect, Switzerland calls upon the Security Council to carry out its responsibility and to work constructively on this matter, as well as on other aspects of the Syrian file. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
the Republic of Korea would like to reiterate our strong support for the CWC as the core pillar of the global disarmament and non-proliferation regime. The achievement that the international community has made since its entry into force was truly remarkable. However, our shared goal of a world free of chemical weapons is still out of reach, as witnessed by repeated use of these weapons around the world, including in Syria. The use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances, constitutes a threat to international peace and security, and perpetrators must be held accountable. In this vein, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its unwavering support for the work of the fact-finding mission to identify the use of chemical weapons in Syria. The FFM has been fulfilling its mission in an independent and professional manner, and we commend the work of the FFM, including its report on the Duma incident, recalling the explanations by the Director General of the OPCW that all available information was examined, weighed, and deliberated before producing its final report. We also appreciate the ongoing efforts of the investigation and identification team that was established in accordance with the decision adopted at the fourth special session of the Conference of the States Parties to identify the perpetrators of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. We look forward to its first report in due course. The Republic of Korea will continue to closely cooperate with the international community to achieve the goal of a world free of chemical weapons. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea. That exhausts the list of speakers, but before we finish the meeting, and I will thank you for participating in it, I would like to give a brief opportunity to the panelists to say a few words before I conclude. And first, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Maxim Grigoriev.
I'll speak Russian. Once again, I'd like to note that the data that we gathered unequivocally proves that the chemical attack in Duma was fully falsified. That information can be verified by anybody who wishes to do so, but and you can also ask those witnesses again. I'll remind you again that those witnesses are permanent residents of exactly that part of Duma in which the bodies were found. And the very fact that they were not in any way injured unequivocally demonstrates that the chemical attack was fabricated. And you'll also understand this and understand it just as well as I understand it if you go and look at that data again. But I understand that political considerations require you to read out the statement that you prepared in advance of this meeting. I also understand that that statement would remain the same in any case, regardless of our statements and our briefings and whatever evidence we may present to you. I also understand that some countries are going to support the white helmets regardless of the realities. In this book I have here, you have clear testimony from former members of this organization that talk about the falsifications that those people personally organized and in which they participated. And in this book, members of the White Helmets say that many of their colleagues were terrorists and militant fighters and participated in killings. There are stories in the book about how White Helmets participated in the violent removal of organs from Syrian women and children. I understand perfectly well that some countries don't need these truths. So returning to the subject of Duma, I would like to recall that those who refuse to accept this evidence are not simply refusing to accept the evidence that this chemical attack was staged, they are also providing cover for the murderers who killed women and children only so that they could organize a fabricated chemical attack. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Jafari.
شكرا زميلي العزيز واسيلي.
Thank you, Vasily. The conversation can go on for hours. I had many comments, but I will not go into details. I will limit myself to a few comments. First, Syria is committed to the credibility of the OPCW. We believe that the OPCW has an important role to play. That is why we are making these comments regarding the inconsistencies and the gaps, as well as the politicization of the work of the OPCW, which is an important part of efforts to maintain international peace and security. Second, Syria joined the NPT in '69 and to the BWC in 1972 and to the CWC in 2013. However, there are certain countries who enjoy attacking us politically in a hysterical manner. As I said in my opening statement, there are 6 mechanisms that have been established to undermine our credibility, even though Israel is yet to join any of these 3 instruments on WMDs. Israel has not joined the BWC, the CWC, nor the NPT. However, those countries that enjoy attacking us would never establish a mechanism to investigate Israel's possession of such weapons. As I said, our chemical weapons program was destroyed and eliminated on board a U.S. vessel, MV Ray. The stocks were transported using a Norwegian and a Danish military vessels onto the board of the U.S. vessel. This has been verified and confirmed by Sigrid Kaag, the head of the joint mission, in her report to the Security Council in June 2014. Since 2014, Syria does not have any chemical weapons program. All 27 production facilities were destroyed, a fact confirmed by the OPCW more than once. Most recently, in its monthly report, its 73rd monthly report issued by the Director General, as well as the report issued by the 92nd round of the Executive Council. The OPCW has confirmed these facts itself more than once. As for those colleagues that referred to the white helmets, those are Erdogan terrorists that were transported to Libya, but they have been fleeing to Italy. They will infiltrate the European Union, just like other white helmet members did before. We congratulate the European Union on welcoming those terrorists in Europe. The same terrorists that they supported in Idlib. Now they have arrived and they will be arriving in Europe. And soon enough, we will hear of the achievements of these terrorists in the European Union. Of course, these terrorists are moderate, as you call them. Congratulate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Shulgin.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether we still have the translation. If this is the case, I can continue. Okay.
During today's meeting, several colleagues accused us of engaging in disinformation. These are baseless accusations. Unlike our colleagues, we only deal in facts. I noted that the distinguished representative of the United States of America made out as though Russia and Syria were doing everything possible to drag out and delay the beginning of the investigation into what happened in Duma. Now, our chairman already explained that that's not true, and I would just add to that that our Syrian colleagues on the 10th of April sent a request to the Technical Secretariat requesting the immediate dispatch of a mission to verify the circumstances of what had taken place. At that time, I was in constant contact every day with the then Director General Uzumchu, and insisted that the experts be dispatched as quickly as possible on the 19th of April. Please note that down. The Director General, Ahmet Uzumcu, published a release warning, letting everyone know that on the 14th of April, a Saturday, a group of OPCW experts would arrive in Syria. However, from the 13th to the 14th of the month at night, the US, the UK, and France launched their missile attacks. So in just the space of just a few hours after that. So this begs the question, is this evidence of those countries' high level of respect for the OPCW? Here they have all underscored their greater level of respect for the OPCW. But in the light of that example, I think, putting it mildly, they don't have a great deal of respect for the OPCW. I'm afraid I also have to disappoint the distinguished ambassador of Germany. He's already left the room. I was in no way paying a compliment to the White Helmets. About them, as it were, providing medical assistance and being good Samaritans. Nothing of the sort. If someone is still here from the German mission, please pass this on to the German ambassador and ask him to look at the July press conference or the April 2018 press conference. There was a young boy, Hassan, who explained at length how the White Helmets dragged him from the hospital. So how can we speak about the nobility of these stages, these provocateurs from the White Helmets? Now, on the subject of the photos, Nikki Haley, at one point, went around the room showing photos of children who allegedly were poisoned in Khan Sheikhoun. Experts then raised questions over those photos, and I'm not going to go into the details of what was wrong with them now, but 10 days after Nikki Haley had showed everybody those photos, the Russian representative to the OPCW wanted to put those photos on the big screen, and the American representative energetically objected to that and categorically refused the display of those photos. The French ambassador said here that the methodology of the FFM's actions were beyond reproach. What reproach are we talking about if they themselves are departing from the established rules, including the chain of custody? I'm asking the representatives and the head of that mission, I have asked that mission face to face, and said you're breaching the rules. You're supposed to gather the samples yourself. And he said to me that that can be accepted without the chain of custody. And for some reason, that's not considered to be serious. Now, it seemed to me that our meeting today is not without its usefulness. Now people are increasingly asking themselves questions. Not too long ago, the OPCW was a successful organization. How have we got to this point now with this organization? What went wrong? Why are we in this deadlock? And thoughtful people, thoughtful delegations are going to start asking the question of perhaps this is linked to the fact that some countries are trying, in the OPCW, to impose their own rules. I can tell you now about how this all took place. Our Western partners took Russia's position on the side of the convention because it is Russia, and underscore this, that is the backbone backing up the CWC. And in the face of that, they warned us and said to us, I can't say exactly what they said, but the sense of what they said was that we will find something to get around this. We don't have a right of veto here in The Hague as we do in New York, and what they did was this decision adopted in June 2019 on the subject of attribution at the special session of the conference. That is an illegitimate decision. I won't go into details now of why it's illegitimate, but they're forcing essentially everyone to play by their own rules. That's only half of the problem. They're thinking up the rules and then they're changing the rules halfway through. They've said to us that you have to absolutely trust the high level of professionalism of the OPCW experts. And then it turned out that when the OPCW experts did not find traces of chemicals weapon use in Duma, then they said to us, no, don't believe the OPCW experts. You have to believe the independent experts that they hired from outside who've conducted this expert analysis. Well, I've already said to you, the impression I have is that the refusal to show us those expert analyses demonstrates probably that these are fictitious people. There actually were no outside experts engaged at all. That is why they're so afraid to show us those expert analyses. To conclude, I want to say that the OPCW has continued to work successfully. In 2013, it won the Nobel Peace Prize, and we need to do everything to preserve this organization, protect it from further degradation. And it's particularly important to do that now, when the international legal architecture is coming apart at the seams. The United States has withdrawn from the Anti-Missile Defense Treaty. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty has fallen apart. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty lays in the balance. The Strategic Nuclear Weapons Treaty is in doubt. So let us preserve and protect the OPCW. And the way to do that is simple. We need to come together and find ways to come out of this deadlock. But in order to do that, it's important to act rather than simply rely on words.
Ambassador, I have a difficult task. I have to wrap up. I have to do it quick. I have to thank everybody, and I have to say something meaningful in the end. First, I would like to thank our interpreters. We really appreciate you being with us today over time, and thank you for the difficult job that you had to do in this afternoon. Secondly, I would like really to thank delegations who came to this meeting, and I was pleasantly surprised. It testifies to the interest member states are paying to the subject that we discussed today. And we were not naive to believe that today's meeting will change the position of some of our opponents. But we wanted to give you evidence and facts that are being neglected or silenced. And this is not disinformation. This is freedom of information. But we know that those who do not want to hear, they won't listen to any arguments. Full stop, and that's it, as our US colleague said today. Today's discussions reveal one thing clearly, that something fishy is cooking in the OPCW. When we point at it, our colleagues tell us every time that OPCW, the 2013 Nobel Prize laureate, is the gold standard of professionalism, integrity, and impartiality. We would like it to be such, and we adopted a presidential statement of the Security Council in November 2019 exactly aiming at this. Unfortunately, the impartiality and integrity of the OPCW Technical Secretariat is seriously questioned, and not just by us and other member states, as today's presentations demonstrated. Members of the Courage Foundation can hardly be labeled Russian agents. They are reputable personalities and include such figures as José Bustani, the first OPCW Director General, respectable members of academic community, former senior officials of the US and UK intelligence communities, and such names as Noam Chomsky or Oliver Stone, to name a few. You were provided a copy of their letter and related materials. Why do some of our colleagues so vehemently defend the reports by the OPCW FFM, which some, I believe, were fabricated? Because any seed of doubt about chemical episodes' conclusions would lead to challenging the expediency and legitimacy of already legitimate missile attacks against a sovereign UN member state. And in that light, the Duma incident plays a key role. Because if it transpires that the FFM report was made up, it would lead to questioning earlier episodes like Han Shi-hun and others, which resulted in the termination of JIM. When today I heard, and when we are reminded that Russia killed JIM, we on our part remind something that somehow goes forgotten, that Russia was proposing to reform the JIM to protect it from manipulation. But our proposal was flatly rejected. And what kind of manipulations? I can't resist to give you just one example. On the conclusion of JIM of an episode on an alleged aerial bombing in Sarmin in 2015, the chlorine bomb was dropped from the altitude of 2 kilometers and went directly into the ventilation shaft of the residential building. The shaft that was just a few centimeters wider than the bomb itself. To our questions on the improbability of this and the clear contradiction to the laws of physics and ballistics, the then JIM answered, yes, it's a miracle, but it happened. How can you believe in the credibility, impartiality, and integrity of such a mechanism after such an answer? Once again, we had no illusions about the positions of member states, but we earnestly aim at restoring the credibility of OPCW, which we see seriously compromised. And today, evidence is a witness to it. The aim was not to present, was not to deflect, deny, or disinform, as somebody said. The aim was to present facts, facts, and facts again. Our colleague from Vietnam asked what to do next and what are the next steps. I think that this issue must be discussed in the OPCW. Legitimate questions and issues that member states are issues should be addressed and discussed. The question why the first report of the OPCW FFM disappeared, was shelved initially and then disappeared and destroyed should be answered. So far we are denied, we and other member states are denied such an opportunity. I think such an opportunity should be provided. In the end, I would like once again, to thank you for your time, to thank you for your active participation, and I hope that the meeting that we organized were useful to all of us, despite sometimes opposite positions that we took. Thank you very much.